Margaret Hale didn't believe in coincidences, fate, or anything she couldn't control with contracts and capital. Until the day she collapsed in her own kitchen and woke up to discover the truth that would shatter her perfectly constructed empire. This is the story of how a maid became a daughter, and how 30 years of lies came crashing down with a single blood test. Margaret Hale sat behind her mahogany desk in her home office, reviewing contracts with the precision of a surgeon. At 58, she had built Hale Properties into a real estate empire that controlled half the commercial district. Her gray eyes scanned numbers with the same intensity she'd used to climb from nothing to everything, never flinching, never doubting. The house around her was a monument to that climb. 14 rooms of marble, glass, and silence. She lived alone, worked alone, and preferred it that way. Control was her religion, and solitude was her sanctuary. Yet lately, something felt different, though she would never admit it aloud. The doorbell interrupted her concentration. Margaret glanced at her watch, 3 o'clock, exactly on time. She'd gone through 4 housekeepers in 6 months. The first talked too much, the second stole. The third had the audacity to rearrange her personal items, and the fourth simply vanished after 2 weeks. Margaret expected this one to disappoint her too. Everyone did, eventually. She pressed the intercom button and released the gate lock, not bothering to rise from her desk. Whoever this woman was, she'd learned quickly that Margaret Hale didn't tolerate inefficiency, familiarity, or questions. When Margaret finally walked to the foyer 10 minutes later, she found a young woman standing just inside the doorway, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to being overlooked. The girl couldn't have been more than 25, petite and unremarkable in a faded blue dress that had seen too many washings. But it was her eyes that made Margaret pause for the briefest moment, brown and deep, holding something that looked almost like recognition. The girl bowed her head slightly, introduced herself as Lily Chun, and asked where she should begin. No small talk, no attempts to ingratiate herself. Margaret approved immediately, though she would never say so. This one might actually last. Over the following weeks, Lily moved through the mansion like a ghost, present but invisible, efficient but silent. She cleaned with a thoroughness Margaret hadn't seen in years, never touching personal items, never lingering where she wasn't needed. But there were small things Margaret noticed despite herself. The way Lily would carefully straighten the photo frames Margaret kept turned face down in the library. How she'd prepare tea at exactly 4 o'clock without being asked, always the right temperature, the right strength. The way she'd pause sometimes when Margaret walked past, as though wanting to say something before thinking better of it. Margaret told herself it meant nothing, that she was imagining patterns where none existed. She had trained herself long ago not to see what she didn't want to see. One evening, Margaret returned from a board meeting to find Lily still working at 9 o'clock, carefully polishing the silver in the dining room. "You should have left hours ago," Margaret said sharply, irritated by this disruption to her routine. Lily looked up, and for a moment, something passed across her face. Not fear, but something sadder. "I wanted to finish, Mrs. Hale. You have the charity dinner tomorrow night." Margaret dismissed her with a wave, but as Lily gathered her things, Margaret found herself asking, "Do you have family, Lily?" The young woman paused at the door, her back still turned. "I did. Once. My mother passed last year." Then she was gone, leaving Margaret alone in the vast dining room, staring at her own reflection in the polished silver, wondering why that simple answer had made her chest tighten. Margaret tried to forget the conversation, but it lingered like smoke. She found herself watching Lily more carefully, noticing things she'd trained herself not to see in people. The graceful way the girl moved, the determined set of her jaw when she thought no one was looking, the way she'd touch the face-down photographs when she thought Margaret wasn't home, as though she knew what they contained. Once, Margaret caught her in the upstairs hallway, staring at a locked door that led to a storage room Margaret hadn't opened in 30 years. "That room is off limits," Margaret had said coldly. Lily had simply nodded and returned to her work, but Margaret had seen something in her expression that made her blood run cold. Not curiosity, but grief, as though Lily already knew what secrets that room contained. But Margaret pushed these observations aside, buried them under work and routine. She had a development deal closing, a city council to influence, an empire to maintain. She couldn't afford distractions, certainly not emotional ones involving a maid she barely knew. Yet at night, alone in her bedroom, Margaret would sometimes take out the one photograph she'd kept from 30 years ago, a hospital bracelet, pink and tiny, with a date and time written in faded ink. She'd hold it and wonder, as she'd wondered for 3 decades whether giving her daughter away had been the right choice or the greatest mistake of her life. She never allowed herself to imagine what that baby might look like now, grown and walking somewhere in the world. It was too dangerous to hope, too painful to regret. What Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Lily Chen knew exactly what was in that locked room, had known from the day she'd accepted this position, and had been carrying her own 30-year-old secret since the moment she'd first seen Margaret's face in a magazine article about successful businesswomen. Lily had spent months tracking down her biological mother through adoption records, foster care files, and private investigators she'd paid with savings from 3 jobs. And when she'd finally found Margaret Hale's name, she'd made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She would work for her mother, protect her mother, and wait for the right moment to reveal the truth that Margaret had spent 30 years running from. But Lily had no idea that moment would come sooner than she thought, and that it would take Margaret's near-death to finally force them both to face what they'd lost. But here's what you need to understand before we go any further. Margaret Hale is about to learn that the biggest deals in life can't be negotiated, and the most valuable things she ever possessed weren't properties or portfolios, but the people she convinced herself she could live without. And in exactly 36 hours, everything she thinks she knows about control, family, and the stranger cleaning her floors is going to shatter in a hospital room under fluorescent lights. The question isn't whether the truth will come out. The question is, will Margaret survive long enough to hear it? Margaret Hale prided herself on never showing vulnerability, never needing anyone, never allowing her body to betray the iron will that had carried her through decades of cutthroat business. But the human body doesn't care about your quarterly earnings or your reputation. And on a cold Tuesday morning in October, Margaret's body decided it had kept her secrets long enough. What happened next would prove that sometimes the people we think are beneath us are actually the only ones willing to save us. Margaret had felt off for weeks, but ignored it with the same determination she applied to everything else that didn't fit her schedule. A tightness in her chest, occasional dizziness, fatigue she attributed to too many late nights reviewing contracts. She was 58 and healthy, or so she'd convinced herself, and she certainly didn't have time for doctor's appointments or weakness. That morning, she'd risen at 5:30 as always, dressed in her usual armor of designer clothing and pearls, and descended to the kitchen to begin her precisely choreographed routine. Coffee, market reports, conference calls. Except this morning, the kitchen seemed to tilt sideways, and the marble counter beneath her hands felt like the only solid thing in a spinning world. She tried to call out, but her voice came out as a whisper. Her legs buckled, and she grabbed for the counter, missing, her expensive coffee cup crashing to the floor in a spray of porcelain and dark liquid. Margaret Hale, who had closed million-dollar deals without flinching, who had faced down corrupt politicians and corporate sharks, felt her body betraying her in the most fundamental way possible. The floor rushed up to meet her, cold tile against her cheek, and her last conscious thought was a bitter one. After all her years of control, her body was going to fail her in her own kitchen, alone, with no one to witness her fall or care if she never got up. She'd built an empire but surrounded herself with emptiness. That was the price she'd chosen to pay. What Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known in that moment, was that Lily had arrived early that morning, worried because Margaret had looked pale the day before. Lily had her own key now, trusted enough to come and go, though Margaret rarely acknowledged this privilege meant anything. Lily had been raised in foster homes where you learned to read the signs of illness in the adults who might suddenly disappear, and she'd seen something in Margaret's movements lately that triggered those old instincts. So she'd come at 6 instead of 8, letting herself in quietly, and that simple decision was about to save Margaret's life in more ways than one. Lily found her seconds later, unconscious and barely breathing on the kitchen floor, and made a split-second decision that would change everything. Lily dropped everything and ran to Margaret's side, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse and found it. Weak and irregular, but there. Her mind raced through the foster care first aid training she'd received years ago. Call 911. Don't move the victim unless necessary. Keep them warm. Monitor breathing. But as Lily cradled Margaret's head and fumbled for her phone, something else moved through her. A desperate, primal fear that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the truth she'd been carrying for months. Please don't die, Lily whispered, her voice breaking. Please. Not before you know. Not before I can tell you. She didn't care if Margaret could hear her. She just needed to say it aloud, even if only to the universe. This woman was her mother, and she was watching her slip away. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes, but to Lily it felt like hours. She rode with Margaret, holding her hand in the back of the vehicle while paramedics worked with professional efficiency, calling out blood pressure numbers and heart rhythms that meant nothing to Lily, but everything to the two men trying to stabilize her mother. At the hospital, they wheeled Margaret away behind double doors, and Lily was left standing in the emergency room waiting area, still wearing her cleaning clothes, hands still shaking, suddenly aware that she had no right to be there, no legal connection to claim, no authority to demand information. She was just the maid, just an employee, just a stranger who happened to find her. Except she wasn't any of those things, and the weight of that secret was crushing her. A nurse approached with a clipboard, asking standard questions. Name? Relationship to patient? Next of kin? Lily stumbled through the answers. I'm her. I work for her. I'm her housekeeper. I don't know about family. She lives alone. The nurse's expression shifted to something between pity and bureaucratic frustration. We need to contact someone with authority to make medical decisions. Does she have any relatives? Lily felt the words rising in her throat. I'm her daughter. I'm her blood. I'm the only family she has, whether she knows it or not. But fear held them back. If she revealed the truth now, they might not believe her. They might think she was trying to scam a wealthy woman. They might ban her from seeing Margaret altogether. So she swallowed the truth and said she'd try to find contact information in Margaret's phone. Margaret's phone was locked, but Lily knew the passcode. She'd seen Margaret enter it dozens of times while cleaning, had memorized it without even meaning to, the way you memorize the patterns of people you're secretly watching. She scrolled through the contacts with trembling fingers. Mom and Dad were listed but marked deceased. A brother, Richard Hale, with a local area code. A niece, Victoria something. Business associates by the dozens. But looking at those names, Lily felt a surge of protective anger she didn't entirely understand. These people, whoever they were, hadn't been there when Margaret collapsed. They didn't visit the mansion. They didn't call to check on her. They were family by blood and strangers by choice, and Lily was a stranger by blood but had chosen to care. Still, she called the brother's number, because that's what the system required. That's what good employees did. Richard Hale arrived 3 hours later, expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive cologne, and an expression that suggested he'd been inconvenienced by this family emergency. He barely glanced at Lily, dismissing her with the casual cruelty of someone who'd spent his life ignoring service workers. He demanded updates from doctors, made calls to corporate attorneys, discussed asset protection with his daughter Victoria, who arrived shortly after. Both of them treating Margaret's crisis like a business problem that needed managing rather than a human being who needed love. Lily watched from the corner of the waiting room, invisible as always, and realized with bitter clarity that these were the people Margaret had chosen over her own daughter 30 years ago. These were the people whose approval had mattered more than keeping her baby. Looking at them now, cold and calculating even in crisis, Lily wondered if Margaret had ever regretted that choice. Hours turned into days. Margaret remained in intensive care, her condition critical but stable, whatever that meant. The doctors used words like cardiac event, complications, monitoring, prognosis uncertain. Richard and Victoria came and went, staying just long enough to consult with lawyers about power of attorney and business continuity plans, treating the hospital like just another corporate office. But Lily stayed. She took vacation days from her only other part-time job, slept in waiting room chairs, survived on vending machine coffee and cafeteria sandwiches. The nurses began to recognize her, offering small kindnesses, an extra pillow, a blanket, updates they probably weren't supposed to give to just the housekeeper. And when visiting hours came, when Richard and Victoria were conspicuously absent, the nurses would quietly let Lily slip into the ICU to sit beside Margaret's bed and hold her hand and whisper the truth she'd been carrying for months. I'm your daughter, Lily would whisper to Margaret's unconscious form. I'm the baby you gave away 30 years ago. My adoptive mother told me before she died. Told me you were young, that powerful. People forced you, that you didn't want to let me go. I found you. I've been working for you for 4 months, and you never knew. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you'd send me away. I was afraid you wouldn't want me now any more than you wanted me then. But I need you to know I forgive you. I forgave you before I ever met you. I just want you to wake up. I want one chance to have a mother before it's too late. Please wake up. But Margaret's eyes stayed closed, and the machines kept beeping their steady rhythm, and Lily wondered if the universe was punishing them both, giving them proximity but not connection, closeness but not completion. Maybe some secrets were meant to die unspoken. But here's what neither Lily nor Margaret's wealthy relatives knew. In exactly 48 hours, Margaret's rare blood type would require a donation that none of her legal family could provide. And when Lily stepped forward to volunteer, when the hospital ran the mandatory compatibility tests, a truth written in DNA and blood would finally surface after 30 years of hiding. The question wasn't whether the secret would come out anymore. The question was whether Margaret would survive to face it, and whether their relationship would survive the revelation. Because sometimes the hardest truth isn't that you gave your child away. It's discovering they came back anyway, and chose to love you from a distance while you never even noticed they were there. If you're feeling the emotional weight of this story, show me by smashing that like button and telling me in the comments. Would you stay by your mother's side even if she didn't know who you were, or would you walk away from someone who abandoned you? Margaret had spent 30 years believing her past was safely buried, and Lily had spent 4 months pretending to be a stranger. But the human body doesn't care about your secrets or your strategies. Blood speaks its own language, and when Margaret's rare blood type became a matter of life or death, that language was about to expose everything they'd both been hiding. What happened next would prove that sometimes the body reveals what the heart is too afraid to confess. On Margaret's 5th day in the ICU, Dr. Samuel Park approached Lily in the corridor with an expression that made her stomach drop. "Miss Chun, we need to talk about Mrs. Hale's treatment options." Lily stood immediately, setting down her 3rd coffee of the morning, bracing herself for bad news. The doctor explained that Margaret's condition had deteriorated. Her heart was struggling, her organs were stressed, and she'd need a rare blood transfusion to support an emergency procedure. "Her blood type is AB negative," Dr. Park said. "It's one of the rarest types, less than 1% of the population. We've contacted blood banks, but local supplies are critically low. We've tested her brother and niece. Neither is compatible." He paused, studying Lily with those kind analytical eyes. "I know you're not family, but have you considered being tested? Sometimes employees, close friends." Lily's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear the rest of his explanation. This was it. This was the moment she'd both longed for and dreaded since the day she'd first knocked on Margaret's door. If she volunteered to be tested, if she was a match, and she knew she would be, had known her own blood type since childhood, had memorized every detail of her medical records searching for connections to a mother she'd never met, then the truth would surface whether she was ready or not. Blood tests didn't lie. DNA didn't negotiate. The nurses would see it, the doctors would see it, and Margaret's family would see it. The secret that had lived quietly in Lily's heart for months would become medical fact, printed on laboratory reports, impossible to deny. But what choice did she have? Let her mother die to protect a secret that had already caused 30 years of damage? "Test me," Lily said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "Test me today." Dr. Park arranged the tests immediately, drawing Lily's blood himself in a small examination room while explaining the compatibility process. "Even with the same blood type, there are other factors," he said gently, clearly trying to manage her expectations. "The chances of a random match are still quite low." But Lily just nodded, watching her dark red blood fill the vial, thinking about how that same blood had once flowed through an umbilical cord connecting her to a mother who hadn't been allowed to keep her. She wanted to tell Dr. Park the truth right then, that this wasn't random, that she wasn't a hopeful employee but a daughter trying to save the woman who'd given her life and then given her away. But she stayed silent. Let the science speak first. Let the evidence be undeniable. Only then would anyone believe her story. The results came back 6 hours later, but Dr. Park didn't seek out Lily immediately. Instead, she watched from her waiting room chair as he had a long, quiet conversation with Richard and Victoria in a consultation room. Animated gestures, raised voices she couldn't hear through the glass, the family's body language shifting from annoyed to confused to hostile. Victoria was shaking her head emphatically. Richard was stabbing his finger at some paperwork, his face red. Dr. Park remained calm but firm, professional but unmoved by their protests. Finally, the family stormed out of the consultation room without even glancing in Lily's direction, and Dr. Park walked toward her with an expression that was equal parts amazement and concern. "Miss Chun," he said quietly, "I think we need to speak privately. Right now." Dr. Park led Lily to a small private office, closed the door, and sat across from her with the kind of careful composure doctors use when delivering news that will change someone's life forever. "Miss Chin Lily, your blood test came back. You're not just compatible with Mrs. Hale. You're a perfect match. AB negative, identical markers across the board." He paused, studying her face. But that's not the unusual part. The lab ran a standard genetic screening as part of the compatibility profile, and he slid a printed report across the desk. "Lily, according to these results, you and Margaret Hale share 50% of your DNA. You're not a random match. You're her biological daughter." The words hung in the air between them, official and undeniable. Lily's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look surprised. She looked relieved, like she'd been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale. "I know," Lily whispered, her voice breaking. "I've known since I started working for her. I'm the baby she gave up 30 years ago." The confession poured out of her then. The adoptive mother who'd finally revealed the truth before dying. The months of searching through records and hiring investigators. The decision to apply for the housekeeping position as a way to be close to Margaret without revealing who she was. The 4 months of silent observation and hidden longing and whispered confessions to an unconscious woman who couldn't hear her. Dr. Park listened without judgment, taking notes, his kind eyes never leaving her face. "Does Mrs. Hale know?" he asked gently. Lily shook her head. "She doesn't even know I exist. She thinks. I don't know what she thinks. That the baby disappeared into the system. That I was better off without her. That 30 years was long enough to forget." Dr. Park was silent for a long moment, processing this information with the measured thoughtfulness that made him good at his job. "This changes things medically and legally," he said finally. "You're the closest living relative we've identified. If Mrs. Hale's condition continues to require critical decisions and she remains unconscious, your relationship gives you legal standing. But ethically, I need to ask, are you doing this to save her life, or to force a relationship she might not want?" The question hurt, but Lily understood why he had to ask it. "Both," she answered honestly. "I'm doing this because she's my mother and I love her, even though she doesn't know me. And I'm doing this because I need her to live. Long enough to decide if she wants me in her life. I need her to have that choice. But I won't let her die to protect a secret that's already broken both our lives." The transfusion was scheduled for the next morning. Dr. Park explained the process. Lily would donate blood. They'd prepare it specifically for Margaret's procedure, and if the surgery went well, Margaret might regain consciousness within 48 hours. "When she wakes up, she'll need to know the truth," Dr. Park said firmly. "I'll have to tell her that you donated, that you're her daughter. Medical ethics require disclosure when there's a biological relationship between donor and recipient, especially in cases where that relationship affects treatment decisions and legal authority. You understand that?" Lily nodded, her stomach tight with fear and hope. 30 years of separation, for months of secret proximity, and now 48 hours until a conversation that would either heal or destroy what fragile connection they had. She'd wanted this moment, but now that it was coming, she felt terrified. What if Margaret rejected her again? What if the truth made everything worse? That night, Lily couldn't sleep in the waiting room chair that had become her temporary home. She kept thinking about what Margaret would say, what Margaret would feel, whether there was any version of this conversation that ended with something other than anger or rejection. She thought about the locked room in Margaret's mansion, the one she'd been told never to enter, and wondered what it contained: baby clothes, memories, evidence of grief Margaret had hidden from the world. She thought about the face-down photographs Margaret kept throughout the house, never looking at them but never discarding them either, like she was punishing herself with reminders of things she'd tried to forget. And she thought about the hospital bracelet Margaret kept in her bedroom drawer, the one Lily had accidentally discovered while putting away laundry, pink and tiny and faded, matching the one Lily's adoptive mother had saved from the hospital 30 years ago. The next morning, they prepared Lily for the donation. She lay on a medical bed in a sterile procedure room, her blood flowing through tubes toward collection bags that would save her mother's life. A nurse monitoring the process smiled at her kindly. "You're very brave to do this for your employer," the woman said, not knowing the truth. "She's lucky to have someone who cares so much." Lily almost laughed at the irony. Lucky wasn't the word she'd use. Complicated. Painful. Necessary. But not lucky. You couldn't call it luck when 2 people who shared the same blood had to be strangers for 30 years because secrets and shame had mattered more than love. But maybe, Lily thought as she watched her blood collecting in the bags, maybe this was how healing started, not with words or apologies, but with sacrifice. With blood given freely to save a life, the way Margaret had given Lily life even if she couldn't give her a home. Hours later, they wheeled Margaret into surgery. Lily wasn't allowed to watch or wait nearby. Family only, they said, and technically she still wasn't recognized as family despite the DNA report sitting in Dr. Park's office. So she sat in that same waiting room chair, exhausted and lightheaded from the donation, watching Richard and Victoria pace and make phone calls and discuss matters that had nothing to do with Margaret's health and everything to do with business continuity and asset protection. They still hadn't acknowledged Lily's existence, hadn't thanked her for the donation, hadn't even looked at her directly. And watching them, Lily felt a cold anger building beneath her exhaustion. These were the people Margaret had protected by giving her daughter away. These were the people whose judgment and approval had mattered more than maternal love. And they couldn't even pretend to care that Margaret was fighting for her life. The surgery took 6 hours. When Dr. Park finally emerged from the operating room, still in his surgical scrubs, he looked exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The procedure was successful, he told Richard and Victoria, barely glancing at Lily though she'd risen from her chair. Mrs. Hale is stable and in recovery. The blood transfusion was critical. Without it, we couldn't have performed the surgery. She's not conscious yet, but her vitals are improving. If things continue as they are, she should wake within the next 24 to 48 hours. Richard asked practical questions about recovery time and when Margaret could return to work. Victoria wanted to know about her cognitive function and decision-making capacity. Neither asked if their aunt was in pain, if she'd been afraid, if she'd called for anyone. Dr. Park's expression hardened slightly. When she wakes, she'll need family support. Real support, not just legal management. His eyes found Lily across the room. She'll especially need to speak with Miss Chun. That comment made Victoria finally turn and look at Lily directly, her expression calculating and cold. "The maid," she said dismissively. "Why would my aunt need to speak with the help?" Dr. Park's jaw tightened. "Because Miss Chun is the donor who saved your aunt's life. And because she has information that Mrs. Hale will need to know when she wakes up." Victoria's eyes narrowed. What kind of information? But Dr. Park just shook his head. "That's between Miss Chun and Mrs. Hale. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to check on other patients. You can see Mrs. Hale once she's transferred to a private recovery room, probably in a few hours." He walked away, but not before giving Lily a small, supportive nod that said more than words. "You did the right thing, and I'll make sure she knows it." Lily returned to her waiting room chair, every muscle in her body aching, her arms sore from the donation, her heart heavy with anticipation and dread. 48 hours. Maybe less. And then Margaret would wake up, and Dr. Park would explain about the blood transfusion. And Margaret would learn that her housekeeper was her daughter. And everything that happened next would depend on a woman Lily barely knew, but had loved from a distance for months. Would Margaret be angry that Lily had deceived her? Would she feel manipulated, trapped by biology and debt? Or would she feel something else, relief, maybe, or curiosity, or that same desperate longing Lily had carried since the day her adoptive mother had finally told her the truth? There was no way to know. All Lily could do was wait, like she'd been waiting her whole life, for a mother she'd never stopped needing. But here's what Lily didn't know. Margaret's family had already figured out that a secret this explosive could destroy their carefully constructed financial plans, and they were already planning how to make sure that secret never became public knowledge. And in exactly 36 hours, when Margaret opened her eyes for the first time and learned the truth about the young woman who saved her life, the real battle wouldn't be between mother and daughter. It would be between blood and money, between love and legacy, between the family Margaret was born into and the daughter she'd given away. Because some people will do anything to protect an inheritance, even if it means destroying the one thing that could actually heal the woman they claim to care about. Margaret Hale built an empire on control and calculation, on never showing weakness and never looking back at choices she couldn't change. But consciousness doesn't negotiate, and when Margaret opened her eyes in that hospital room, she was about to learn that some debts can't be paid with money, some truths can't stay buried in locked rooms, and some people refuse to stay forgotten no matter how hard you tried to erase them. This is the moment everything changes. The awakening that would force both women to face what they'd lost and what they might still save. Margaret's first conscious thought was pain, a deep, surgical ache in her chest that made breathing feel like work. Her second thought was confusion about the sterile white ceiling above her, the beeping machines, the hospital smell of antiseptic and recycled air. Her third thought, as her eyes focused and her mind cleared, was rage at her own body for betraying her, for showing weakness, for putting her in this vulnerable position. She tried to sit up and couldn't, tried to speak and found her throat raw and dry. A nurse appeared immediately, smiling with practiced kindness, adjusting monitors and speaking in soothing tones. "Mrs. Hale, welcome back. You're in the hospital. You've been unconscious for 6 days. You had a cardiac event and emergency surgery. Please don't try to move too quickly. Your body needs time to recover. 6 days. Emergency surgery. Cardiac event." The words filtered through Margaret's mind like a bad dream she couldn't wake from. She'd lost nearly a week of her life, a week of deals and decisions and control. The business, who'd been managing things. The contracts, had anything been signed without her approval? And why did her chest hurt so much, like someone had literally opened her up and rearranged her insides? The nurse explained the procedure in simple terms, talking about blood transfusions and surgical repairs, and how lucky Margaret was to have survived. "You had a very rare blood type complication," the nurse said. "If we hadn't found a compatible donor, the surgery might not have been possible." Margaret processed this information with growing unease. "Who?" she rasped, her voice barely working. "Who donated?" The nurse's expression shifted to something awkward, uncertain. "Dr. Park will want to discuss that with you himself. He asked to be notified immediately when you woke up. I'll page him now." She left quickly, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and her pain, and a growing sense that something was very wrong with this picture. Margaret Hale didn't accept vague answers or deferred explanations. She demanded clarity, required transparency, insisted on knowing every detail of every situation that affected her life. But lying in that hospital bed, weak and in pain and dependent on machines just to monitor her breathing, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: fear. Not the business fear of failed deals or market crashes, but deeper, more primal. The fear of not being in control. The fear of owing debts she couldn't repay. The fear that her carefully constructed walls were about to come crashing down. Dr. Park arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that Margaret immediately recognized. The look of someone about to deliver news you didn't want to hear. He pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down, which meant this conversation was going to take time, which meant the news was complicated. Margaret braced herself for bad outcomes, for limitations on her recovery, for restrictions on her life that would interfere with her work. But she wasn't prepared for what he actually said. "Mrs. Hale, I'm glad you're awake. You gave us quite a scare. The surgery was successful, but there are some things you need to know about your treatment, particularly about the blood transfusion that made your surgery possible." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The donor was someone close to you. Someone who's been at the hospital every day since your collapse." Margaret's mind immediately went to her brother Richard or her niece Victoria. Family obligation, corporate necessity. "Richard?" she guessed, her voice still hoarse. Dr. Park shook his head. "Your brother and niece were both tested. Neither was compatible. In fact, with your rare blood type, we were concerned we wouldn't find a donor in time." He met her eyes directly. "The person who donated, who saved your life, was Lily Chen. Your housekeeper." The words landed like physical blows. Lily, the quiet young woman who cleaned her floors and prepared her tea and moved through the mansion like a ghost? That made no sense. Blood type compatibility wasn't common, certainly not between random strangers. Unless. How? Margaret demanded. How is that possible? Random compatibility with AB negative is. Not random, Dr. Park interrupted gently but firmly. "Mrs. Hale, when we ran the compatibility tests, the lab also performed a standard genetic screening. It's protocol for blood donations from non-family members. The results showed something unexpected." He turned his tablet to face her, showing a medical report filled with technical language and highlighted sections. "Lily Chen shares 50% of her DNA with you. She's not your employee, Margaret. She's your daughter. Your biological daughter." The beeping of the heart monitor suddenly seemed very loud in the silence that followed. Margaret stared at the report, at the percentages and markers and genetic codes that spelled out an impossible truth. Her hands started shaking. Her vision blurred. And somewhere deep inside, in the place where she'd buried 30 years of grief and guilt and what-ifs, something cracked open like a dam finally breaking under pressure. "No," Margaret whispered, But it wasn't denial of the facts. It was denial of the implications, of the reality that the young woman she'd been ordering around for 4 months was the baby she'd given birth to 3 decades ago. The baby she'd been forced to surrender. The daughter she'd convinced herself was better off without her. The child she'd tried to forget every single day since. No, that's... How did she? Does she know? Dr. Park nodded slowly. She knew before she started working for you. She's known who you were for months, Margaret. She found you deliberately. She's been taking care of you, watching over you, and when you collapsed, she was the one who found you. She rode in the ambulance. She's barely left the hospital. And when we needed blood, she volunteered without hesitation, knowing the test would reveal who she was. She saved your life twice, once in your kitchen and once with her blood. The implications crashed over Margaret like waves. Lily had known. All this time, cleaning her house, serving her meals, listening to her cold instructions and sharp criticisms, Lily had known they were mother and daughter. She'd worked in silence, kept the secret, watched Margaret from a distance while Margaret had never even noticed, had never looked closely enough to see the familiar shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, the features that might have reflected her own if she'd bothered to look. And now Lily's blood was literally flowing through Margaret's veins, keeping her heart beating, binding them together in the most physical way possible. Margaret had spent 30 years trying to forget, and her daughter had spent months trying to connect. The cruelty of it was almost unbearable. "Where is she?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. I need to see her." Dr. Park stood and walked to the door, speaking quietly to someone in the hallway. Margaret's heart was racing. She could see it on the monitor, the numbers jumping, and she tried to prepare herself for what she was about to face. What do you say to a daughter you abandoned? How do you explain choices you'd made when you were young and powerless, when powerful people had forced your hand, when keeping your child meant destroying your career and your family's reputation? How do you apologize for 30 years of absence? And what if Lily hated her? What if the months of silence had been about revenge, not love? What if saving Margaret's life was about moral obligation, not forgiveness? Margaret realized with sudden, painful clarity that she had no right to expect anything from this young woman, no right to demand explanations or opportunities or second chances. She had forfeited those rights 3 decades ago in a hospital not unlike this one. And then Lily stepped into the room, and Margaret saw her, really saw her, for the first time. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable once you knew to look for it. The same high cheekbones. The same straight posture despite humble clothing. The same way of holding her hands clasped in front of her when uncertain. Margaret's mother used to stand exactly that way. Features Margaret saw in her own mirror every morning, now reflected in this young woman who was both stranger and blood. Lily's eyes were red from crying, dark circles beneath them from days without sleep, her modest clothes wrinkled from living in hospital waiting rooms. She looked exhausted and terrified and hopeful all at once, and she stopped just inside the doorway, as if afraid to come closer without permission. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. They just looked at each other across the small hospital room, across 30 years of separation, across the chasm of secrets and loss and all the words that had never been spoken. Finally, Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Lily. Just the name, nothing else, because what else was there to say? Every apology felt insufficient. Every explanation felt like an excuse. But Lily took a tentative step forward, then another, moving toward the bed with the careful uncertainty of someone approaching something fragile and precious that might break or disappear. "Mom," she said softly, testing the word, trying it out for the first time in Margaret's presence. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and consequence. Margaret started crying. Not the controlled, silent tears she'd mastered in boardrooms when she'd had to appear emotional but composed, but real, raw sobbing that shook her shoulders and made her chest wound ache and stripped away every defense she'd ever built. And Lily rushed forward then, abandoning caution, reaching for Margaret's hand and holding it with both of hers, tears streaming down her own face. "I'm sorry," Margaret gasped out between sobs, the words inadequate but necessary. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to give you up. They made me. My family, my father. He said keeping you would destroy everything, that you'd be better off with people who could raise you properly, that I was too young and it was a scandal and—" The excuses tumbled out, 30 years of justifications and rationalizations, and the lies she'd told herself to make the unbearable bearable. But Lily squeezed her hand and shook her head. "I know," she said gently. My adoptive mother told me before she died. She told me you were young, that you didn't have a choice, that powerful people forced your hand. I know you didn't abandon me because you didn't love me. I know the system took me from you. I've known that for over a year. That's why I found you. That's why I came here. I needed to see you, even if you never knew who I was. They talked for over an hour, though Dr. Park kept checking in to make sure Margaret wasn't overexerting herself. Lily told her about growing up in foster homes, about the kind adoptive mother who'd eventually taken her in permanently, about learning the truth and searching for Margaret, about getting hired and watching from a distance, about whispering confessions to Margaret's unconscious form in the ICU. Margaret told her about the pregnancy, about the man she'd loved who'd been pushed aside by her family, about the night she'd given birth and held her baby for exactly 2 hours before they'd taken her away, about the locked room in her mansion that still contained baby clothes she'd bought 30 years ago but never got to use. They cried together. They laughed awkwardly through tears. And slowly, carefully, they began to build a bridge across the chasm that had separated them for 3 decades. But even in that moment of connection, Margaret felt a growing dread about what came next. Her family, Richard and Victoria, didn't know about this conversation yet, but they would soon. And knowing them, knowing how they operated, knowing that Margaret's will currently left significant portions of her estate to them, she realized that Lily's sudden appearance as a biological heir would be seen not as a miracle, but as a threat. They would fight this. They would question the DNA results, hire lawyers, create complications. They would try to paint Lily as an opportunist, a gold digger, someone trying to manipulate a sick old woman. And Margaret, still weak from surgery, still recovering, would have to choose, for the second time in her life, between her family's expectations and her daughter's rightful place in her life. Except this time, she was determined to make a different choice. "There's something you need to understand," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger despite her exhaustion. "My family, my brother Richard and my niece Victoria, they won't accept this easily. They've been managing my business interests, expecting to inherit substantial portions of my estate. Your existence changes everything legally, financially. They'll see you as a threat." Lily's expression shifted, showing hurt but not surprise. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. "I never wanted that. I just wanted to know you. I just wanted to understand where I came from and have one conversation with my mother before one of us died. That's all." Margaret squeezed her hand. "I believe you. But they won't. And I need to warn you, they can be ruthless. My brother spent his whole life in corporate law, finding loopholes, destroying opposition. If they think you're trying to claim what they consider theirs, they'll come after you." As if summoned by the conversation, the hospital room door opened abruptly without a knock. Richard and Victoria entered with the presumptuous authority of people accustomed to access and control, their expensive clothes and cold expressions jarring against the intimate moment they'd just interrupted. Victoria's eyes went immediately to Lily's hand holding Margaret's, and her lip curled in disgust. "So it's true," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "The maid has convinced you she's your long-lost daughter. How convenient. How perfectly timed." Richard crossed his arms, his lawyer's expression calculating and hostile. "Margaret, you're recovering from major surgery. You're vulnerable, medicated, not thinking clearly. This girl has obviously researched you, found some way to fake DNA results, and is trying to exploit your weakened state. We need to discuss this privately, without the con artist present." Margaret felt something ignite inside her. That familiar fury that had carried her through decades of business battles, but now directed at her own family for the first time. "Get out," she said, her voice low and dangerous despite her physical weakness. "Both of you, get out of my hospital room right now." Richard barely blinked. "Margaret, be reasonable. This opportunist has obviously manipulated." "Dr. Park," Margaret interrupted, her voice gaining strength, "please explain to my brother and niece how DNA testing works. Explain how it can't be faked, how the hospital lab processed these results, how their conspiracy theory is scientifically impossible." Dr. Park stepped forward, his professional composure barely masking his irritation. "The DNA test was processed by our certified laboratory using standard protocols. The results are conclusive and cannot be fabricated. Lily Chen is biologically related to Mrs. Hale with 99.99% certainty. This is scientific fact, not opinion." Victoria's expression turned even colder. "Then she's been planning this for months. She deliberately infiltrated your home, gained your trust, waited for an opportunity like this surgery to reveal herself when you were most vulnerable. It's psychological manipulation, Aunt Margaret. Can't you see that? But Lily spoke up for the first time, her voice quiet but steady. I never asked Mrs. Hale for anything. I worked for fair wages, did my job, and kept my identity secret because I was afraid she wouldn't want to know me. I donated blood because she was dying and I'm her daughter, and I couldn't let her die even if she never acknowledged me. If I wanted money, I would have hired lawyers and sued for recognition months ago. I just wanted to know my mother. The simple honesty in those words, the lack of defensiveness or anger, seemed to land harder than any argument could have. Margaret pulled herself more upright in the bed, ignoring the pain in her chest, every inch the formidable businesswoman who'd built an empire. Let me make something absolutely clear to both of you. Lily is my daughter. She saved my life twice. And whether you accept that or not is irrelevant, because I'm changing my will immediately. I'm ensuring that Lily receives what she should have had from birth: recognition, inheritance, and a place in this family. If you can't accept that with grace, then you're welcome to leave my life entirely. I've spent 30 years protecting this family's reputation at the cost of my own daughter. I'm done sacrificing her for your comfort. The steel in her voice, the authority that had cowed corporate opponents and city officials, was now directed at her own blood relatives. Richard and Victoria exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from hostility to calculation. They were already strategizing, already planning their next moves. You're making a mistake, Richard said coldly, already heading toward the door. A mistake you'll regret when this girl shows her true colors. But we'll be here to help you pick up the pieces when this fantasy falls apart. Come on, Victoria. They left without another word, the door closing behind them with a soft click that somehow felt more ominous than a slam. The silence that followed was heavy with tension and the weight of battles yet to come. Lily looked shaken, her hand trembling in Margaret's grasp. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to cause problems with your family. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should just— Don't, Margaret interrupted firmly, squeezing her hand. Don't apologize for existing. Don't apologize for saving my life. And don't even think about disappearing again. I lost you once because I was too weak to fight for you. I'm not making that mistake again. Dr. Park, who'd remained quietly by the door throughout the confrontation, approached the bed with a gentle smile. Mrs. Hale, I think you need rest now. This has been an extremely emotional day on top of major surgery. Lily, you should rest too. You've barely slept in a week, and you just donated blood yesterday. You're both running on fumes. But neither woman wanted to separate, not after finally finding each other, not with the threat of Richard and Victoria looming. Margaret looked at Dr. Park with pleading eyes. Can she stay? Please. I need. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. Dr. Park's expression softened. Visiting hours are over, but given the circumstances, I think we can make an exception. Just keep it quiet, and Lily, please try to get some actual sleep in that chair. You're no good to anyone if you collapse yourself. As darkness fell outside the hospital window, Margaret lay awake despite her exhaustion, watching Lily sleep in the chair beside her bed. Her daughter. The words still felt surreal, impossible, like a dream she was afraid to fully believe in case she woke up. Lily's face in sleep looked younger, more vulnerable, showing the child she'd once been. The baby Margaret had held for 2 hours before they'd taken her away. Margaret remembered those 2 hours with painful clarity now, after decades of trying to suppress the memory. The weight of the baby in her arms. The perfect tiny fingers. The way she'd counted toes and memorized features, trying to imprint every detail in her mind because she'd known, even then, that it was all she'd ever have. And now here was that same child, grown and sleeping beside her, after choosing to come back despite having every reason to stay away. Margaret made a silent vow then, one she intended to keep no matter what it cost her. She would protect Lily from Richard and Victoria's schemes. She would publicly acknowledge her as her daughter. She would split her estate equally, giving Lily everything she should have had from birth. And more than that, she would try to be a mother, even though she'd missed 30 years and had no idea how to close that gap. It wouldn't be easy. There would be awkward conversations and painful revelations and decades of missed moments that could never be recovered. But they'd have time now. Time to build something real, something true, something that wasn't based on secrets or shame or the cruel choices of people who'd valued reputation over love. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling Lily's hand still holding hers. And for the first time in 30 years, she allowed herself to feel something she'd thought was lost forever: hope. But while mother and daughter slept in that hospital room, finding peace for the first time in decades, Richard and Victoria were already making calls, already consulting lawyers, already building a case to prove that Lily was an opportunist and that Margaret wasn't competent to make decisions in her current state. And they had resources, connections, and 30 years of experience protecting the Hale family interests from threats exactly like this. The battle for Margaret's heart might be won, but the battle for her legacy and Lily's place in the family was just beginning. And in exactly 72 hours, Richard would file legal papers that would force Margaret to make the most difficult choice of her life: her empire or her daughter, her reputation or her redemption, the family that raised her or the child she'd been forced to abandon. If this reunion just destroyed you emotionally, show me by hitting that like button right now and tell me in the comments. Are you Team Margaret and Lily, or do you think Richard and Victoria have a point about protecting the family assets? Margaret Hale spent 40 years building an empire worth hundreds of millions, but she never imagined that the greatest threat to her legacy wouldn't be market crashes or corporate takeovers. It would be her own family, willing to destroy her relationship with her daughter to protect their inheritance. And Lily Chun, who'd grown up with nothing and expected nothing, was about to learn that sometimes being recognized as someone's child comes with a price tag that might cost more than either of them could afford to pay. This is where love meets money, where blood battles greed, and where two women discover that fighting for each other means fighting against an entire system designed to keep them apart. Richard had moved fast. Within 72 hours of Margaret's revelation in the hospital, he'd assembled a legal team, filed preliminary motions, and begun the process of having Margaret declared temporarily incompetent to make major financial decisions while recovering from surgery. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Claim concern for Margaret's well-being while systematically undermining her authority to change her will or estate planning. "We're not contesting that the girl is biologically related," Richard explained to his attorneys, his voice cold and tactical. "That's undeniable. What we're questioning is whether Margaret is in a sound mental and emotional state to make dramatic changes to her estate immediately after major surgery, while under obvious emotional manipulation. We're protecting her from making decisions she'll regret when she's thinking more clearly." The lawyers nodded approvingly, already drafting motions and preparing arguments. This was business, after all. Just business. Margaret learned about the legal maneuvering from her own attorney, Thomas Chun. No relation to Lily, though the shared last name made Margaret smile despite the situation's gravity. Thomas was in his 60s, sharp-eyed and unflappable, and he'd been Margaret's legal counsel for 20 years. He sat beside her hospital bed with a tablet showing the court filings, his expression serious. "They're going after your competency, Margaret. Claiming the surgery, the medication, and the emotional shock of discovering Lily have impaired your judgment. They want a court-appointed guardian to oversee your finances until you're recovered enough to make sound decisions. Which, conveniently, gives them time to restructure assets and make sure Lily gets nothing even if you eventually change your will." Margaret felt rage building beneath her exhaustion. Can they actually do this? Thomas hesitated. They can try, and with enough money and the right judges, they might succeed temporarily. But we can fight it. Fight it, Margaret said immediately. Fight it with everything we have. I am not letting my brother and niece steal my daughter's inheritance, using my own temporary weakness as a weapon. What do we need to do? Thomas began outlining strategy. Independent medical evaluations to prove Margaret's competency, documentation of her consistent decision-making abilities, even while hospitalized, character witnesses, and crucially, a DNA expert to testify about the validity of Lily's biological relationship. But Margaret, Thomas added carefully, you need to understand what fighting this publicly means. Right now, this is all happening in family court under seal. If we fight aggressively, it becomes public record. The media will find out. Your business associates will know. The whole story, the pregnancy 30 years ago, giving up the baby, Lily working for you without you knowing. It all becomes public knowledge. Your privacy, your carefully controlled reputation, everything you've protected for decades gets exposed. Margaret looked past Thomas to where Lily stood by the window, her daughter's face showing fear and guilt, and the beginning of that familiar expression. The one that said maybe it would be easier if Lily just disappeared, just walked away, just let Margaret's life return to the carefully controlled state it had been before. And Margaret realized that this was her test. 30 years ago, She'd chosen reputation over her child because powerful people had convinced her it was the right thing to do, that the scandal would destroy them both, that secrecy was protection. Now she had another choice: protect her privacy or protect her daughter. Her empire or her family. Her past shame or her future possibility. There was really no choice at all. Make it public, Margaret said firmly. File whatever we need to file. Let the media know everything. I'm done hiding. I'm done being ashamed of the most important thing I ever did, even if it took me 30 years to admit it. The news broke 2 days later when Thomas filed their response to Richard's motion, including a counterpetition that laid out the full story in legal but unmistakable terms. Margaret Hale, real estate mogul, had given birth to a daughter 30 years ago under family pressure, recently been reunited with that daughter who had saved her life, and was now being subjected to a competency challenge by relatives motivated purely by financial greed. He included the DNA results, character affidavits, and Margaret's own sworn statement about her mental capacity and her intentions regarding Lily. By that afternoon, every major news outlet in the city was running the story. Real estate queen's secret daughter. Heiress hidden for decades. Family fortune fight over long-lost child. Margaret's phone, recovered from her house and now on her hospital bedside table, rang constantly with calls from reporters, business associates, old friends, and curious strangers. She ignored them all, but she couldn't ignore what this meant. Her private shame was now public knowledge. But something unexpected happened. The public response wasn't universally negative. Yes, there were critics who questioned Lily's motives, skeptics who suspected fraud despite DNA evidence, and trolls who attacked Margaret for being a bad mother. But there were also thousands of messages of support, from adoptees who'd searched for biological parents, from women who'd been forced to give up children, from people who saw this as a story about redemption rather than scandal. Margaret's hospital room filled with flowers from strangers with notes that said things like, "You're brave for choosing her," and "It's never too late for family," and "She came back because she loves you." Lily read these notes aloud to Margaret, both women crying and laughing at the unexpected grace of strangers when family had shown only cruelty. Margaret's business associates were more complicated. Some reached out with support, others with concerned questions about her decision-making. Still others with barely veiled attempts to assess whether this drama would affect ongoing deals. But Margaret Hale hadn't built an empire by being fragile, and she handled each call with the same professional competence that had earned her respect for decades. "Yes, Lily is my daughter," she'd say calmly. "Yes, I'm changing my estate planning. No, this doesn't affect our current projects or my business acumen. And if you have concerns about working with someone who prioritizes family over fortune, then perhaps we weren't good partners to begin with." Several deals fell through. Several partnerships ended. But Margaret discovered she didn't care as much as she'd thought she would. Losing business hurt less than losing her daughter would have. The competency hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after Richard's initial filing. Thomas explained that they'd present Margaret in person, strong, articulate, clearly capable of complex decision-making, along with expert testimony from Dr. Park and independent psychologists who'd evaluated her. "But they'll bring their own experts," Thomas warned, who'll testify about post-surgical cognitive impairment, emotional vulnerability, and susceptibility to manipulation. They'll paint Lily as a calculated opportunist who targeted a lonely woman. It won't be pleasant. Lily looked stricken. "Maybe I should testify that I don't want any money," she suggested desperately. "Maybe if I sign something saying I'm giving up all inheritance rights, they'll drop this whole thing and leave us alone." But Margaret reached for her hand. "Absolutely not. You're not giving up what's rightfully yours just because they're making this difficult. We fight this together or not at all." As Margaret's strength returned and the hearing date approached, Thomas arranged for her to be discharged from the hospital and continue recovery at home. But going home meant something different now. "You're moving in," Margaret told Lily firmly, not phrasing it as a question. "The house has 14 rooms, and I'm rattling around in there alone anyway. You need a decent place to live. I need someone around during recovery, and honestly, we've lost 30 years. I don't want to waste any more time." Lily looked uncertain. "People will say I'm taking advantage of you, that I'm inserting myself into your life for money." "People are already saying that," Margaret interrupted. "Let them talk. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's what matters. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "you already know where everything is. You've been cleaning the place for months." The drive to Margaret's mansion felt surreal to both women. Lily had made this drive dozens of times as an employee, always arriving at the back in trance, always invisible. Now she was sitting in the passenger seat of Margaret's luxury car, driven by Margaret's regular driver, who'd been briefed on the situation and treated Lily with careful respect, heading to the front door as family. Margaret watched the city pass outside the window, thinking about how much had changed in 2 weeks. She'd collapsed alone in her kitchen. She'd nearly died. She'd discovered her daughter. She'd chosen that daughter over everything else. And now she was going home to start building something she'd never allowed herself to have before. A real family, messy and complicated, and worth every sacrifice. When they arrived at the mansion, Margaret walked Lily not to the maid's quarters but upstairs to the guest wing. A suite of rooms with a bedroom, sitting area, and private bathroom that Margaret had kept professionally decorated but never used. "This is yours now," Margaret said, opening the door. "For as long as you want it. Make it your own. Change anything you don't like. This isn't temporary employee housing. This is your home." Lily stood in the doorway of this space that was larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to be your daughter," she whispered. "I don't know the rules, or how rich people live, or how to act in a place like this. I'm going to mess everything up." Margaret pulled her into a hug, their first real embrace, and held her tightly. "I don't know how to be your mother either. We'll figure it out together. We'll mess it up together. That's what family does." That evening, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 30 years. She opened the locked room, the one Lily had stood before months ago, the one that contained secrets Margaret had been too afraid to face. Inside were boxes of baby clothes never worn, a crib that had never been assembled, stuffed animals with tags still attached, photo albums empty except for one picture, a newborn baby, 2 hours old, wrapped in a pink blanket. "I bought all of this before they took you away," Margaret said quietly, both women standing in the doorway looking at this shrine to grief. "I couldn't use it, but I couldn't throw it away either. I told myself I'd deal with it someday. I just locked the door instead." Lily picked up the photograph, staring at her own infant face. "You kept this. All these years, you kept this." Margaret nodded. "I kept everything. I just couldn't look at it. Couldn't let myself remember. But maybe now we can finally put these things to use. Not the baby items, obviously, but maybe we can finally let go of the grief and keep the love." They spent that night going through the boxes together, crying and laughing and telling stories. Margaret described the pregnancy, the father Lily had never known who'd disappeared under family pressure, the 2 hours she'd held her newborn daughter before the adoption agency came. Lily described her childhood in foster care, the kind adoptive mother who'd finally given her stability, the moment she'd learned the truth and decided to search for her biological mother. They filled in 3 decades of blank space with words, slowly building a shared history where none had existed before. And somewhere around midnight, exhausted and emotional and surrounded by memory boxes in what had been a locked room, both women realized they were laughing more than crying. The healing had begun. But even in that moment of connection, both women knew what was coming. In less than 2 weeks, they'd face Richard and Victoria in court. Legal experts Margaret didn't know would examine her, question her judgment, analyze her emotions like data points. Lily would be cross-examined, her childhood scrutinized, her motives dissected. The worst parts of their story would be displayed in a public courtroom for strangers to judge. And the outcome would determine not just Margaret's legal right to distribute her own assets, but whether society would recognize their relationship as legitimate or dismiss it as exploitation. It was one thing to find each other in a hospital room. It was another thing entirely to make the world accept what they'd found. The week before the hearing, Margaret made a decision that surprised even Thomas. She called a press conference. "You don't have to do this," he warned. "In fact, I'd advise against it. Anything you say can be used in the hearing. The other side will analyze every word." But Margaret was done hiding. She appeared on the mansion's front steps, elegant in a tailored suit, strong despite still recovering, Lily standing beside her in borrowed professional clothes. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. And Margaret spoke with the same calm authority she'd used in 1,000 business presentations. "I'm Margaret Hale. This is Lily Chin, my daughter. 30 years ago, I was forced to give her up for adoption under family and social pressure. I've regretted that decision every day since. When Lily found me, she didn't reveal who she was," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight. She worked for me for 4 months, took care of my home, and when I collapsed from a cardiac event, she saved my life. When I needed rare blood during surgery, she donated without hesitation, knowing the tests would reveal our biological relationship. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. She simply wanted to know her mother. Margaret paused, looking directly into the cameras. My brother and niece are now attempting to have me declared incompetent to make financial decisions, claiming I'm being manipulated. Let me be clear. The only manipulation that occurred was 30 years ago when I was pressured to give up my child. I am fully competent, fully aware, and fully committed to ensuring my daughter receives what should have been hers from birth. If my family cares more about inheritance than about my happiness, that tells you everything you need to know about their priorities. The questions came rapid fire after that. Ms. Hale, are you saying your family forced you to give up your baby? Lily, what do you say to critics who claim you're a gold digger? How much of the estate will Lily receive? Do you regret the years you lost? Margaret handled each question with practiced composure, but when a reporter asked Lily directly, "What do you want from your mother?" Lily stepped forward to the microphone. Her voice was quieter than Margaret's, less polished, but it carried a sincerity that no media training could manufacture. "I want what I've always wanted," Lily said simply. "A mother. Someone who knows my birthday and asks about my day and cares if I'm okay. I grew up in foster care. I know what it's like to have nothing. Money doesn't make you less lonely. I found my mother because I needed family, not because I needed funds. If she gave me nothing but her time and her truth, I'd consider myself the richest person here." The press conference went viral within hours. Social media exploded with debate. Some people calling Margaret brave, others calling her foolish, some calling Lily an inspiration, others calling her a con artist. But the tide of public opinion was shifting. The image of a wealthy woman publicly choosing her daughter over her fortune, of a young woman asking only for connection rather than wealth, resonated with millions of people. By the next morning, #TeamLily and #MotherDaughter Reunion were trending. Margaret's mansion was surrounded by supporters holding signs reading "Family over Fortune" and "It's never too late for love." The public pressure wouldn't change the legal proceedings directly, but it changed the context. Richard and Victoria's strategy of painting Margaret as a confused victim and Lily as a manipulator became harder to sustain when the world was watching and rooting for the opposite narrative. The competency hearing arrived too quickly and not fast enough. Margaret dressed in a severe charcoal suit that commanded respect, Lily beside her in the professional outfit Margaret had bought for her. Their first shopping trip together, awkward but meaningful. They arrived at the courthouse to find it surrounded by media and supporters, people shouting encouragement and holding signs. Inside, the courtroom was cold and institutional, designed for judgment rather than compassion. Richard and Victoria sat on one side with their legal team, expressions smug and confident. Margaret and Lily sat on the other with Thomas, holding hands under the table like lifelines keeping each other steady. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Marianne Torres, known for her no-nonsense approach and immunity to emotional manipulation from either side. This would be decided on facts, not feelings. Richard's attorney went first, painting a picture of a vulnerable woman who'd undergone major surgery, was still on medication, and had been emotionally overwhelmed by discovering the daughter she'd given up decades ago. "Mrs. Hale has built an empire through careful, calculated decisions made with a clear head," the attorney argued. The decisions she's attempting to make now, dramatically restructuring her estate immediately after surgery, based entirely on emotional factors, in favor of someone she's known consciously for less than 2 weeks, are completely out of character with her established pattern of decision-making. This suggests impaired judgment, not malice. We're asking the court to protect Mrs. Hale from making irreversible financial decisions during a vulnerable period. Once she's fully recovered, if she still wishes to change her estate planning, she'll have that opportunity. It was a reasonable-sounding argument designed to look like concern rather than greed. When it was Thomas's turn, he presented Dr. Park, who testified that Margaret had been fully coherent throughout her recovery, had made complex medical decisions independently, and showed no signs of cognitive impairment beyond normal post-surgical fatigue. He presented Margaret's business associates, who testified that she'd handled conference calls and business decisions from her hospital bed with her usual acuity. He presented the independent psychological evaluation showing Margaret was not only competent, but actually happier and more emotionally healthy since reconnecting with Lily than she'd been in years. The opposing counsel wants you to believe that emotional decisions are inherently impaired decisions, Thomas argued. But making choices based on love and family rather than purely financial considerations is not impairment. It's humanity. Margaret Hale spent 30 years making cold, calculated decisions that built wealth, but cost her the things she valued most. Now she's choosing differently. That's not incompetence. That's wisdom. Then came Margaret's testimony. She took the stand with the same confidence she'd brought to 1,000 business negotiations, sworn in, and faced Richard's attorney with steel in her eyes. They tried everything. Questions about her medication, her emotional state, whether she'd considered the tax implications of her planned changes, whether she truly believed Lily wasn't motivated by money. Margaret answered each question with devastating clarity. I've reviewed the financial implications with 3 different advisors. I understand exactly what I'm doing. As for whether Lily wants my money, she lived in a 400-square-foot apartment and worked 2 jobs before this. She could have hired attorneys and sued for recognition and a portion of my estate the moment she confirmed I was her mother. Instead, she cleaned my house for minimum wage and saved my life twice without expecting anything in return. If you can't see the difference between that and gold digging, that says more about your values than hers. The opposing attorney tried a different angle. Mrs. Hale, isn't it true that you gave up your daughter 30 years ago because you believed it was the best decision for both of you? That you were young, unprepared for motherhood, and that adoption provided her with opportunities you couldn't offer? Margaret's expression hardened. No, I gave up my daughter because my father threatened to disinherit me, destroy the father of my child professionally, and make sure the scandal ruined any chance I had at a career. I was 28 years old, not 16. I was perfectly capable of raising a child. I was forced to choose between my family's approval and my daughter's life. I made the wrong choice, and I've regretted it every single day for 30 years. Don't you dare try to rewrite that coercion as maternal sacrifice. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge looked moved. When Lily took the stand, Richard's attorney was brutal. He questioned her childhood, her adoptive mother's death, the timing of her search for Margaret, her decision to work as a maid rather than reveal herself. Isn't it convenient, he suggested, that you positioned yourself in Mrs. Hale's home, gained her trust, and waited until she was most vulnerable, unconscious in a hospital, to reveal your identity? That sounds like a calculated strategy, not a daughter's love. Lily's hands were shaking, but she met his eyes directly. I worked for my mother because I was terrified she'd reject me if I told her who I was. I waited until she was unconscious to say the words, "I'm your daughter," out loud because that was the only time it felt safe, when she couldn't send me away. I donated blood because she was dying, and I'm her daughter, and what kind of person lets their mother die to protect a secret? If wanting to know where you came from and who your mother is makes me a con artist, then I guess that's what I am. The testimony lasted 3 days. Expert witnesses on both sides. Character witnesses. Financial analysts. By the end, everyone in that courtroom had heard every detail of Margaret and Lily's story, every painful choice, every moment of separation and reunion. Judge Torres called a recess before rendering her decision, leaving both sides to wait in anxiety and hope. Margaret and Lily sat on a courthouse bench in a quiet hallway, exhausted and emotionally drained, still holding hands. "Whatever happens," Margaret said quietly, "I want you to know, finding you, acknowledging you, choosing you publicly, that was the right decision regardless of what this judge says. Even if they give Richard temporary control of my assets, even if we have to wait years to sort this out, I don't regret any of it." Lily squeezed her hand. "Neither do I. I got to know my mother. I got to save her life. That's worth more than any inheritance." When they were called back into the courtroom, Judge Torres looked at both parties with an expression that gave nothing away. "I've reviewed the testimony, the medical evidence, the psychological evaluations, and the financial documentation," she began. "This court's responsibility is to determine whether Margaret Hale possesses the mental capacity to make major financial decisions at this time, not to judge the wisdom of those decisions or the motivations of the parties involved." Margaret felt her heart sink. That sounded like the beginning of a ruling against them. But the judge continued. "The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that Mrs. Hale is fully competent. Her post-surgical recovery has been excellent. Her cognitive function is unimpaired. Her business decisions made during her recovery show her usual acumen. The psychological evaluation shows improved mental health, not deterioration. And most importantly, her testimony was clear, consistent, and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the financial implications of her intended actions. Furthermore, Judge Torres said, her voice taking on a harder edge, this court finds the petitioner's claims of concern for Mrs. Hale's well-being to be undermined by their own actions and motivations. The timing of this petition, filed immediately after Mrs. Hale announced her intention to change her will, suggests financial motivation rather than genuine concern for her welfare. The characterization of Lily Chun as a manipulator is contradicted by the evidence, which shows a young woman who worked honestly, saved Mrs. Hale's life twice without expectation of reward, and whose reunion with her biological mother has brought joy rather than harm to Mrs. Hale's life. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Lily was openly crying, both hands now gripping Margaret's. Therefore, the petition for temporary guardianship and competency evaluation is denied. Margaret Hale retains full authority over her financial and personal decisions. This court hopes that the Hale family can find a way to support Mrs. Hale's choices rather than fighting them, but that is ultimately not a legal matter. This case is closed. The courtroom erupted in applause from the public gallery, supporters who'd attended every day of the hearing. Richard and Victoria stood immediately and left without a word, their attorneys following with grim expressions. Margaret and Lily couldn't stop crying, holding each other in the middle of the courtroom, while Thomas shook hands with well-wishers and reporters tried to get statements. "We won," Lily kept saying. "We actually won." But Margaret knew this was about more than a legal victory. They'd won the right to be mother and daughter publicly, legally, without shame or secrecy. They'd won the right to build a family on their own terms. And most importantly, they'd proven that love, even love delayed by 30 years, could triumph over greed, doubt, and the systems designed to keep people in their designated places. This was just the beginning. That night, back at the mansion, Margaret did something she'd never done before. She gathered her entire household staff, the people who'd worked for her for years, who'd been kind to Lily when she was just the new maid, who'd stayed loyal through the media circus, and introduced Lily properly. "This is my daughter," she said simply, her arm around Lily's shoulders. "She's family. She lives here now. And I need all of you to know how grateful I am that you treated her with kindness, even when she was just another employee. That kind of decency matters more than you know." The staff applauded, some of them crying, and one of the older housekeepers hugged Lily and whispered, "We always thought there was something special about you. Now we know why." It was a small moment, but it meant everything. The people who'd witnessed both of their lives separately were now witnesses to their lives together. But victory in court doesn't mean the war is over, and Margaret knew that Richard and Victoria weren't the type to accept defeat gracefully. They had connections, resources, and decades of experience finding alternative paths to get what they wanted. And while Margaret and Lily celebrated their legal win in a downtown law office, Richard was already meeting with a different kind of attorney, one who specialized in media manipulation, public relations disasters, and destroying reputations so thoroughly that even legal victories became Pyrrhic. Because if they couldn't challenge Margaret's competency in court, they'd try something even more dangerous. They'd challenge Lily's character in the court of public opinion, and sometimes, that's the arena where truth matters least and damage lasts longest. Margaret and Lily thought the courtroom victory was the end of their battle, but they were about to learn that Richard and Victoria Hale didn't get rich by accepting defeat gracefully. When legal tactics fail, wealthy people have another weapon: the media, the internet, and the terrifying power to turn public opinion against you with carefully crafted lies mixed just right with damaging truths. This is the chapter where being right doesn't matter, where facts become casualties, and where mother and daughter discover that the cruelest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from family who know exactly where to strike. 3 days after the court ruling, the first article appeared. It was published on a gossip website known for salacious stories about the wealthy, but it had enough credibility that mainstream outlets sometimes picked up its stories. The headline read, "Secret Daughter or Skilled Scammer? Inside Lily Chen's Suspicious Past." The article was masterfully written. It acknowledged the DNA evidence but raised questions about Lily's behavior. Why had she worked as a maid instead of revealing herself immediately? Why wait until Margaret was unconscious to confess? And most damaging, The article included interviews with former foster siblings and acquaintances who described Lily as calculating, always working angles, and obsessed with finding rich relatives. The quotes were taken out of context, distorted, or outright fabricated, but they painted a picture of a woman who'd spent years planning to exploit her biological mother. Margaret found the article when her assistant showed it to her over breakfast, her face troubled. Margaret read it with growing fury, recognizing immediately the sophisticated character assassination at work. This wasn't random internet trolling. This was professionally crafted reputation destruction, the kind that costs serious money and connections. "Richard," she said immediately. "This has his fingerprints all over it." She showed the article to Lily, who read it with hands that started shaking worse with each paragraph. By the end, Lily was crying. "They talked to people from my old foster home," she whispered. "People I haven't seen in 15 years. They took things I said as a hurt teenager and made them sound like I was planning to find you and exploit you. That's not. I never." Her voice broke. "What if people believe this? What if they think I'm exactly what this article says I am?" "No one who matters will believe it," Margaret said firmly, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Perception shaped reality in ways that facts couldn't always correct. She immediately called Thomas, who'd already seen the article and was consulting with a defamation attorney. "It's technically legal," Thomas explained grimly. "They're raising questions rather than making direct accusations. They're quoting real people, even if those quotes are misleading. And they're hiding behind the public interest argument since you both made yourselves public figures with that press conference. We can threaten legal action, but actually winning a defamation case would be difficult and time-consuming." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Then we respond. We do another press conference. We refute every claim." That's exactly what they want," Thomas interrupted. "Every response keeps the story alive. This is a PR war, not a legal battle. We need a different strategy." But the article was just the opening salvo. Within 48 hours, 3 more similar pieces appeared on different websites. Then a local news station picked up the story for an investigative segment that featured experts questioning whether elderly wealthy people needed better legal protection from biological relatives who might manipulate them. A podcast devoted an entire episode to analyzing whether DNA evidence should be enough to claim inheritance rights. Social media exploded with debate. Hashtag LilyChenez scammer began trending alongside hashtag Protect Margaret Hale. The narrative was shifting from heartwarming reunion to sophisticated con. And each new article included slightly more damaging revelations. A job Lily had been fired from 7 years ago, she'd actually quit, but the article made it sound suspicious. Debt she'd accumulated from community college, portrayed as financial desperation. Even the fact that she'd changed her last name from her foster family's name to her adoptive mother's name, framed as someone hiding their identity. Lily stopped leaving the house. The mansion became both sanctuary and prison as photographers camped outside the gates, hoping to catch an unflattering photo or provoke a reaction. Supporters who'd lined the streets during the trial were outnumbered now by protesters holding signs that read, "DNA doesn't equal love," and "Protect our elders from scammers." Lily watched from the upstairs windows, her expression hollow. "They're right," she said quietly one evening, Margaret standing beside her. "Not about me being a scammer, but about, maybe I shouldn't have hidden who I was. Maybe I should have been honest from the start instead of working as your maid. It looks worse when they frame it like this." Margaret put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "You were protecting yourself. You were afraid of rejection. That's human, not calculating. Don't let them rewrite your story just because they're telling it with malice." But the worst came 5 days after the first article. A woman appeared on a morning talk show, someone who claimed to be Lily's former foster sister. She was well-dressed, articulate, and utterly convincing as she described a teenage Lily who'd been obsessed with finding her birth parents, who'd talked constantly about how rich they probably were, and who'd said she'd make them pay for abandoning her. The host asked leading questions designed to paint Lily as damaged, vengeful, and calculating. The foster sister even cried as she said, "I feel bad for Margaret Hale. She's being manipulated by someone who learned in foster care how to play on people's guilt. Lily was always good at making people feel sorry for her." Margaret watched the interview with Lily beside her, felt her daughter flinch with each accusation, saw her curl into herself like she was trying to disappear. And Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Helpless rage at a situation she couldn't control with money or authority or business acumen. That's Jessica, Lily whispered, staring at the screen. We were in the same foster home when we were 16. We weren't close, but we weren't enemies either. I never said those things. I barely even talked about my birth parents because it hurt too much. Her voice was breaking, dissolving. Why would she lie like that? What did they pay her? How much was I worth to destroy? Margaret turned off the TV and pulled Lily into a fierce embrace. It doesn't matter what they paid her. It doesn't matter. What lies they're spreading. I know who you are. I know what you did for me. And we're going to fight this. But privately, Margaret was calculating the damage. Business partners were calling with concerns. Board members were suggesting she take some time off to deal with family issues. Her carefully built reputation was being eroded not by her own actions, but by association with Lily, and she could feel the empire she'd built starting to question her judgment. Thomas called an emergency meeting that evening at the mansion. He brought a crisis management expert named Diana Reeves, a black woman in her 50s with 20 years of experience in reputation repair for high-profile clients. She didn't sugarcoat the situation. You're losing the PR war, Diana said bluntly, spreading media analysis reports across Margaret's dining table. The narrative has shifted from heartwarming reunion to possible exploitation. Richard and Victoria have done this beautifully. They're not attacking you directly, Margaret. They're attacking Lily, which makes you look naive and manipulated by extension. Every day this continues, more people question your judgment. Your business reputation suffers. And Lily becomes more toxic as a public figure. She looked at both women seriously. We have two options. Option 1. Lily disappears from public life. You keep your business relationships, your reputation stabilizes, and you maintain your relationship privately. Option 2. We fight back hard, but it means exposing more of your personal lives, more vulnerability, and no guarantee we win. No, Margaret said immediately. Lily's not disappearing. She's not hiding. We don't give them what they want. But Lily's expression showed something else. The look of someone who'd learned in foster care when to make herself small to survive. Margaret, she said quietly, maybe Diana's right. Maybe if I step back, this all goes away and your life goes back to normal. You don't need this. You built everything yourself. I don't want to be the reason you lose it. Margaret grabbed both of Lily's hands, forcing her daughter to look at her. Listen to me. I spent 30 years building an empire instead of a family. I chose money over you once already. I'm not making that mistake again. If my business associates can't understand that I'm prioritizing my daughter, my child who I lost and found, then I don't want their business. If board members question my judgment for refusing to abandon you a second time, they can find another CEO. You are not the problem here. They are. Diana nodded slowly, a slight smile crossing her professional expression. Okay then, we fight, but we do it smart. We don't respond to every accusation. That makes us look defensive. Instead, we go on offense. We find the money trail connecting Richard and Victoria to these media attacks. We expose the PR firm they hired. We investigate the people giving interviews and show they were paid. We document every lie, every distortion, every manufactured quote. And then we release it all at once in a way that's impossible to ignore. We turn this from a story about Lily's questionable motives into a story about a wealthy family trying to destroy a reunion out of greed. But, she warned, this will get ugly. They'll escalate. They'll dig into both of your pasts looking for anything embarrassing or damaging. Every mistake either of you ever made will be weaponized. You need to be prepared for that. Margaret thought about her own past. The affair that had produced Lily, the man she'd loved who'd been pushed aside, the abortion she'd considered before deciding to carry the pregnancy to term, the 2 hours she'd held her baby before surrendering her. All of it would come out. All the private pain she'd locked away would become public consumption. But looking at Lily, her daughter, who'd suffered far worse growing up in the foster system, who'd been brave enough to find her biological mother despite knowing she might be rejected, who'd donated blood to save a woman she barely knew, Margaret felt something settle into certainty. Do it, she said. Investigate everything. Expose everyone. Bring the whole ugly truth into the light. I'm done hiding. We both are. Lily squeezed her hand, tears in. Her eyes, but something like hope in her expression. For the first time since the smear campaign started, she looked like she believed they might actually survive this. The investigation took 3 days and cost Margaret a small fortune in private detective fees, but it was worth every penny. Diana's team traced the gossip articles back to a PR firm that had received a six-figure payment from a shell corporation owned by Richard's law firm. They found email correspondence between Richard's office and the firm explicitly discussing narrative management and reputation mitigation regarding the Chin situation. They discovered that Lily's supposed foster sister had been paid $50,000 for her television appearance, and that she'd actually only lived in the same facility as Lily for 6 weeks, not years. They documented how the experts discussing elder manipulation were affiliated with a think tank that Richard's firm had donated to substantially. Every attack, every article, every concerned citizen could be traced back to Richard and Victoria's coordinated, expensive campaign to destroy Lily's reputation, and by extension, Margaret's judgment. Margaret and Diana scheduled a press conference for the following day. But this time, they didn't just invite media, they invited everyone. Social media influencers who'd covered the story. The original reporters who'd written sympathetic pieces about the reunion. And crucially, they invited Richard and Victoria themselves, though both declined to attend. The press conference was held at Margaret's corporate headquarters, a power move that put her on her own territory, surrounded by the empire she'd built. Margaret stood at the podium with Lily beside her, but this time, they weren't defensive. They were armed with evidence. "I'm going to tell you a story," Margaret began, her voice calm but cutting. "A story about what happens when wealthy people decide that inheritance matters more than human connection. A story about character assassination as a business strategy. And a story about exactly how much it costs to try to destroy a young woman's reputation when you have money and no conscience." For the next 45 minutes, Margaret and Diana systematically dismantled every attack that had been made against Lily. They showed the financial trail connecting Richard to the PR firm. They played recorded phone calls between the firm and reporters suggesting story angles. They presented affidavits from people who'd been approached and offered money to lie about Lily. They showed the background of the foster sister, including her own criminal record and financial desperation that had made her vulnerable to being bought. They exposed the experts who'd questioned Margaret's judgment as paid consultants with ties to Richard's firm. It was methodical, devastating, and utterly convincing. With each revelation, reporters in the audience looked more shocked. Social media started exploding, not with attacks on Lily this time, but with outrage at Richard and Victoria's tactics. Then Margaret did something that shocked everyone in the room. She displayed her own past, the pregnancy, the pressure from her family, even the identity of Lily's father, whom she'd protected for 30 years. "I was 28 years old and in love with a man my family didn't approve of," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the personal nature of the revelation. "When I got pregnant, my father told me I could give up the baby and stay in the family business, or keep her and be disinherit, and the father would be destroyed professionally. I made the wrong choice. I gave up my daughter to protect myself and the man I loved. I've regretted it every single day since. When Lily found me and worked for me without revealing who she wasn't being manipulative. She was protecting herself from potential rejection by a mother who'd already given her up once. She had every reason to believe I'd send her away. Instead, she saved my life twice and asked for nothing in return. If my own family can't see the difference between that and exploitation, that's their moral failure, not hers." The questions that followed were different from the hostile interrogations they'd faced weeks earlier. "Will you be pressing charges against your brother? How do you respond to accusations that you're being vindictive? What do you want people to understand about your relationship with Lily?" Margaret handled each one with calm authority, but she deferred several to Lily, giving her daughter space to speak for herself. And Lily, who'd been silent and defensive through weeks of attacks, finally found her voice. "I'm not here because I want Margaret's money," she said clearly. "I'm here because I wanted to know where I came from and who my mother was. Growing up in foster care, you dream about biological parents who might want you back. When I found out Margaret had been forced to give me up, I understood. I forgave her before I ever met her. I just wanted a chance to know her, even if she never knew who I was. Everything else, the blood donation, the court case, this press conference, all of this came from other people's choices, not mine. I just wanted a mother." The press conference ended with a standing ovation from the reporters, an unprecedented response that showed how dramatically the narrative had shifted. Within hours, #TeamLily was trending again, overwhelming the previous attacks. The gossip sites that had published the smear articles were now being criticized for inadequate fact-checking. The The morning show that had featured the paid foster sister issued an apology and announced an internal review of their booking process. Legal analysts were discussing whether Richard and Victoria could face consequences for orchestrating a defamation campaign. And most satisfying, Margaret's business partners who'd expressed concerns were now calling to apologize and reaffirm their relationships. Diana had been right, going on offense, exposing the truth, turning the story from Lily's questionable motives to Richard's undeniable malice. That had changed everything. That night, back at the mansion, Margaret and Lily collapsed in exhausted relief. They'd won, not just the court case, but the much harder battle for public perception and the right to their own narrative. Lily's phone was exploding with supportive messages from strangers, interview requests from major publications, even apologies from some of the people who'd attacked her online. Margaret's business was not only stable but somehow stronger. Several partners had expressed admiration for her willingness to fight for family over reputation, saying it showed character they respected. They ordered takeout, Lily's first choice, Chinese food from a place near her old apartment, and ate it on the floor of Margaret's study, too tired to be formal, just mother and daughter sharing a meal and processing everything they'd survived. "Thank you," Lily said quietly, "for not hiding me, for choosing me even when it was hard. I know what it cost you." Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're worth everything it cost and more. I should have fought for you 30 years ago. I'm just glad I got a second chance." But even in victory, Margaret knew this wasn't truly over. Richard and Victoria had been exposed, humiliated, and legally blocked from contesting her decisions, but they were still out there, still family, still carrying resentment that wouldn't disappear just because they'd lost a battle. And there was still the matter of Margaret's will, her estate, the formal integration of Lily into both her personal life and her business legacy. They'd won the right to be mother and daughter publicly, but they hadn't yet figured out what that actually meant day to day. How to build a relationship with a 30-year gap in it, how to be family when you'd been strangers for so long, how to make up for lost time when you couldn't actually recover what was gone. Those questions didn't have easy answers, but at least now they had the space and freedom to figure them out together, without secrets, without shame, and without anyone trying to tear them apart for money or reputation. But here's what neither Margaret nor Lily knew in that moment of relief. Richard and Victoria might have been defeated in public, but they had one final card to play, something they'd been holding in reserve, a secret about Lily's biological father that Margaret had protected for 30 years. And when desperate people have nothing left to lose, they'll burn down everything rather than admit defeat. In exactly 5 days, a man Margaret hasn't spoken to in 3 decades will walk back into her life, and the reunion that healed Margaret and Lily is about to get even more complicated when the third part of their family triangle finally emerges from the shadows. Because apparently, finding your daughter is just the beginning. Sometimes you have to face the man you loved and lost to finally close all the chapters that got left open 30 years ago. If you're emotionally invested in this reunion and need to know what happens when Lily's father enters the picture, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me. Do you think Margaret should have revealed his identity earlier, or was she right to protect him for 30 years? Margaret had told the world about Lily's father during that press conference, but names and truth are different things. She'd given facts without context, revelation without reunion. She thought that chapter of her life was closed, a footnote in a larger story now focused on her daughter. But here's what Margaret forgot. When you make someone's identity public after protecting it for decades, you don't control what they do with that information. And sometimes, the people you thought you'd successfully left in the past have been waiting for permission to come back. This is the chapter where family gets even more complicated, where father meets daughter, and where Margaret has to face the man she loved and lost, and decide whether some relationships can survive 30 years of silence. The phone call had come 2 days after the press conference. Margaret hadn't heard his voice in 30 years, but she recognized it immediately. Deeper now, aged like she was aged, but unmistakably James Mitchell, the man she'd loved when she was 28 and foolish, and believed love could conquer family expectations. "I saw the press conference," he'd said simply. "I know about Lily. I'd like to meet her. And I think we should talk first. Just us. Before I complicate things more than they already are." Margaret had agreed to meet him at a neutral location, this coffee shop halfway between her mansion and his architectural firm office. She'd told Lily where she was going, watched her daughter's face shift through a dozen emotions at the news that her biological father wanted to enter the picture. "Do you want me to come with you?" Lily had asked. Margaret had shaken her head. Let me talk to him first. Let me see where his head is before we make this more complicated than it already is. James Mitchell walked into the coffee shop at exactly 3 o'clock, and Margaret's breath caught despite 30 years of preparation. He was 58 now, same age as her, and time had been both cruel and kind. Gray threaded through his dark hair, lines around his eyes, a slight thickness to his frame that came with middle age. But he still moved with that same quiet confidence, still had those same thoughtful eyes that had seen through her corporate armor 3 decades ago. He spotted her immediately, smiled, that same slightly crooked smile that had undone her completely when she was younger, and walked over with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was just as uncertain about this meeting as she was. Margaret, he said simply, sitting down across from her. You look exactly the same. She laughed, actually laughed, despite the tension. Liar. We both look exactly 30 years older. The ice broke slightly, though the weight of their history hung between them like fog. They talked carefully at first, skating around the real subject, his architectural firm, her real estate empire, the careful dance of two people who'd once been intimate now learning to be strangers with shared history. Then finally, James said what they'd both been avoiding. When your father came to my office 30 years ago and told me to disappear, told me that staying in your life would destroy both our careers and harm the baby. I believed him. I was a 29-year-old junior architect at a firm that did business with your father's company. He had the power to destroy me professionally, and he made it clear he would. So I walked away. I told myself you and the baby would be better off without me, that I was being noble by not dragging you down. He paused, looking at his coffee. I was a coward. I should have fought harder. I should have refused to let him separate us. I've spent 30 years wondering what happened to that baby, hoping she had a good life, hating myself for not being strong enough to be her father. Margaret felt old anger stirring, but also understanding she wouldn't have had 3 decades ago. I was angry at you for years, she admitted. Angry that you disappeared, that you chose your career over us, that you made it so easy for my father to separate us. But I also made the same choice, didn't I? I gave up our daughter to protect my career and my family's approval. We were both cowards. We both let powerful people convince us that love wasn't enough. She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand but close. But Lily found me anyway. She came back despite both of us failing her. And now she's asking about you. Now she wants to know about the father she never met. So the question is, are you still a coward, or are you ready to be the father you should have been 30 years ago? The James looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since sitting down, and Margaret saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Not the young man she'd loved, but something perhaps more valuable. The man he'd become after 30 years of regret. I want to meet her, he said firmly. I want to know my daughter. I don't have illusions about being her father in any real sense. I wasn't there for her childhood, her struggles, any of the moments that matter. But if she's willing to let me into her life now, even peripherally, I want that chance. I need that chance. He paused, then added quietly, and Margaret, I never stopped thinking about you either. About us. About what we could have been if we'd been braver. The vulnerability in those words hit Margaret harder than she'd expected. She'd built walls for 30 years, convinced herself that chapter was closed, that love from 3 decades ago couldn't survive in the present. But looking at James now, seeing the same essential kindness beneath the aging, she felt something stir that she'd thought was long dead. One step at a time, Margaret said carefully, though she didn't pull her hand away. First, you meet Lily. We see how that goes. She's been through enough emotional upheaval. Reunion with me, court battle, media attacks. Adding a father to the mix needs to be handled carefully. She gets to control the pace. She gets to decide how much or how little she wants from you. And James. She squeezed his hand once before withdrawing hers. She's been hurt enough. If you're not absolutely certain you can commit to knowing her, if there's any chance you'll disappear again when things get complicated, then don't start this. It's better to be absent than to abandon her twice. James nodded solemnly. I understand. And I'm certain. I've spent 30 years regretting not fighting for her. I won't make that mistake again. They talked for another hour, filling in the gaps of 3 decades. His marriage that had ended in divorce 5 years ago, her single-minded focus on business that had left her isolated, both of them successful but fundamentally lonely, both of them carrying the ghost of a daughter they'd given away. That evening, Margaret returned to the mansion to find Lily pacing in the living room, clearly having spent hours in anxious anticipation. "How did it go?" Lily asked immediately, her voice tight with nerves. Does he want to meet me? Or did he just want closure with you?" Margaret pulled her daughter into a hug, feeling the tension in Lily's body. "He wants to meet you. Very much. He's been carrying regret for 30 years just like I have. But Lily, this is completely your choice. You don't owe him anything. You don't have to have a relationship with him just because he donated DNA. You've built a life without him. If you want to keep it that way, I'll support that decision completely." But Lily shook her head against Margaret's shoulder. "I want to meet him. I've wondered about him my whole life. My adoptive mother didn't know much about him, just that he was an architect and that he'd been pressured to leave. I want to know where that part of me comes from. What if he's disappointed? What if he expected something different?" Margaret pulled back to look at her daughter directly. "Lily, he's not going to be disappointed. You saved my life. You fought for our relationship when it would have been easier to walk away. You've survived things he and I can't even imagine, foster care, loss, all of it. If anything, we're the ones who should worry about disappointing you." She brushed Lily's hair back from her face in a gesture that was becoming familiar, maternal. "But I want you to be prepared. Adding him to this dynamic changes things. Right now, it's just us figuring out how to be mother and daughter. Adding your father means navigating a more complex family structure, especially since James and I have our own complicated history. It might get messy." Lily managed a small smile. "Everything about this has been messy. What's a little more complication?" But her hands were shaking as she said it, and Margaret could see the weight of another major emotional event settling on her daughter's already burdened shoulders. They arranged the meeting for 2 days later, at the mansion, Margaret's territory, where Lily felt safest. Margaret hired a family therapist to be present, someone who specialized in adoption reunions and could help navigate what promised to be an emotionally charged situation. Dr. Sarah Chun, no relation to Lily despite the shared surname, was a Chinese-American woman in her 40s with a calm, grounded presence that immediately put everyone at ease. She met with Margaret and Lily separately the morning of the meeting, helping them process expectations and anxieties. "Remember," Dr. Chin told Lily gently, "you don't have to feel anything specific. You don't have to love him instantly, or even like him. You're allowed to be angry that he wasn't there, even if you understand intellectually why he made the choices he did. Whatever you feel in that moment is valid. This isn't a performance for anyone's benefit. It's just 3 people with shared history trying to figure out if they can have a shared future." When James arrived that afternoon, Margaret answered the door herself, wanting to control the pace of this reunion. He stood on her doorstep holding flowers, not roses, but simple daisies, the kind that didn't presume too much. "For Lily," he explained. "I didn't know what else to bring. Do you bring gifts when meeting the daughter you abandoned? There's not exactly etiquette for this." Margaret saw the fear beneath his attempted humor and felt an unexpected surge of compassion. She led him to the living room where Lily waited, Dr. Chin sitting quietly to the side, ready to intervene if the emotional weight became too much. And then father and daughter saw each other for the first time since Lily was 2 hours old in a hospital Margaret had fled from 30 years ago. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. Lily had James's eyes, the same thoughtful brown that could see through pretense, the same slight tilt of her head when she was thinking. James's breath caught audibly. "God," he whispered, "you look just like my mother. She would have loved you so much." Lily couldn't speak at first. She just stared at this man who was genetically half of her, but completely unknown. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You're taller than I expected. I always imagined you from old photos Margaret described, but photos don't capture height." It was such a mundane observation that it broke the tension completely. James laughed, a surprised, emotional sound, and took a tentative step forward. "I'm about 6'1". Apparently that's average, though I've always felt it was a bit awkward. Too tall for economy airplane seats, not tall enough for basketball. The small talk was absurd given the gravity of the moment, but it gave them both something to hold on to while their emotions caught up with reality. Dr. Chin gently guided them to sit down, and for the next 2 hours they talked, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. James told Lily about his family, about the grandmother she'd never meet who'd passed away 10 years ago, about his work as an architect, about the marriage that hadn't worked partly because he'd been comparing everyone to the woman he'd lost 30 years ago. Lily told him about foster care, about the families that hadn't worked out, about Mrs. Chun who'd finally adopted her at age 14 and given her the stability and love she'd needed. She told me about you before she died, Lily said. She'd tracked down the adoption records somehow. I think she knew someone who knew someone. She told me you were an architect, that you'd been young and scared, that you'd been pressured to leave. She said she thought you'd probably wondered about me, hoped I was okay. She was right, wasn't she? James nodded, tears streaming down his face now, not bothering to hide them. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I imagined you might be having. I wondered. I hoped. I told myself you were better off, that I'd made the right choice by staying away. But it was a lie I told myself to make the guilt bearable. The raw honesty in his voice seemed to reach something in Lily, and suddenly she was crying too, and then they were both crying, and then somehow Lily was hugging him, this stranger who was her father, and he was holding his daughter for the first time since she was a newborn, and 30 years of absence collapsed into that single embrace. When they finally pulled apart, all three adults were emotionally exhausted. Dr. Chun suggested they take a break, reconvene in an hour after everyone had time to process. James stepped outside to the mansion's garden, and Margaret joined him after a few minutes, finding him sitting on a bench staring at nothing, looking overwhelmed. That was harder than I expected, he admitted. Seeing her, talking to her, realizing exactly what I missed, 30 years of her life, all the moments I should have been there for. How do you make up for that? How do you even begin? Margaret sat beside him, their shoulders touching in a way that felt both familiar and strange. You don't make up for it, she said quietly. You can't. The past is gone. You can only build something new from here forward. Be present now. Be the father she needs today, not the father she needed 30 years ago. That's all any of us can do. They sat in silence for a few minutes before James said something that surprised Margaret. I never stopped loving you, you know. I told myself I did, convinced myself that 30 years was enough time to move on. But seeing you again, being in your presence, watching you be a mother to our daughter. He paused. I know this is complicated. I know we can't just pick up where we left off 3 decades ago. But Margaret, is there any chance, any possibility, that we could find out what might have been if we'd been braver back then? Margaret's breath caught. She'd been so focused on her relationship with Lily, on being a mother, that she hadn't let herself think about what James's return might mean for her personally. But sitting here beside him, feeling the echo of something she'd thought was dead, she realized that maybe some connections didn't die. They just waited dormant for the right moment to resurface. I don't know, she said honestly. Right now, Lily needs to be the priority. She's the one who's been hurt most by our choices. But James, ask me again in 6 months. After we've all figured out what this new family dynamic looks like. Then maybe we can explore what we might still be to each other. When they returned inside, they found Lily and Dr. Chun talking quietly. Lily looked up as they entered, and something in her expression suggested she'd suspected exactly what Margaret and James had been discussing. So, Lily said with a slight smile that wasn't quite steady, are we doing this? Are we actually trying to be some kind of family? Because I need to know if this is temporary, or if you're both actually committed, because I can't do temporary anymore. I've had enough temporary families to last a lifetime. James and Margaret exchanged glances, then both moved to sit with Lily, flanking her on the couch. We're committed, Margaret said firmly. Whatever this family looks like, however unconventional or complicated, we're in this together. No more running. No more choosing reputation or comfort over each other. We're a family now. All 3 of us. We're just figuring out what that means. James nodded agreement. I've spent 30 years running from the best thing I ever helped create. I'm done running. Lily, I can't be the father I should have been, but I'd like to try to be the father you need now if you'll let me. Dr. Chin suggested they establish some ground rules and expectations. They agreed to family dinners once a week, low pressure, just time together. James would reach out to Lily directly, not through Margaret, establishing their own relationship independent of the mother-daughter dynamic. They'd be honest about uncomfortable feelings, jealousy, resentment, awkwardness, rather than pretending everything was perfect. And most importantly, they acknowledged that this wasn't a fairy tale reunion where everything magically worked out. This was 3 damaged people trying to build something real from the wreckage of choices made 30 years ago. It would be messy and complicated and sometimes painful. But they were all willing to try, and sometimes willingness is enough to start with. As the session ended and James prepared to leave, Lily walked him to the door. Margaret watched from a distance as daughter and father had a quiet conversation, saw Lily hug him goodbye with less hesitation than before, saw James touch her face gently before leaving, both of them crying again but smiling through it. After James left, Margaret and Lily sat together in the quiet living room, processing everything that had happened. "That was intense," Lily said finally, understating dramatically. "I have a father now. Like, an actual father who wants to know me. That's not something I ever really believed would happen." She turned to Margaret with a searching expression. "And he still loves you. I could see it. The way he looked at you. The way you looked at him when you didn't think anyone was watching. Mom, are you going to give him another chance?" The word, Mom, still made Margaret's chest tighten every time Lily used it. "I don't know yet," Margaret admitted. 30 years is a long time. We're different people now. But Lily, whatever happens between James and me, it won't affect my relationship with you. You're my priority. You're my daughter. That doesn't change regardless of whether your father and I figure out if we can be anything more than co-parents." Lily leaned her head on Margaret's shoulder. "I know. I trust you. I'd like you to be happy, Mom. And I think maybe he makes you happy. It's okay to want that for yourself too." That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about the improbable family they were becoming. A daughter lost and found. A love abandoned and potentially rekindled. 3 people brought together by biology and separated by cowardice, now trying to build connections that should have been forged decades ago. It wasn't the family Margaret had imagined when she was young and pregnant and terrified. But maybe it was the family she needed now, complicated and unconventional, and built on honesty about past failures rather than pretense about present perfection. She thought about James's question in the garden, about whether there was a chance for them. 6 months ago, she would have said no without hesitation. But now, with Lily sleeping down the hall, with the possibility of actually building something real rather than just managing appearances, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Hope that maybe it wasn't too late for any of them to have the lives they'd sacrificed 30 years ago. But even as Margaret allowed herself to feel hopeful, she couldn't shake a lingering unease. Richard and Victoria had been quiet since their smear campaign was exposed, too quiet. And Margaret knew her brother well enough to recognize strategic retreat versus genuine defeat. They'd been humiliated publicly, lost their legal challenge, and watched their schemes unravel. People like that didn't just accept loss and move on. They regrouped. They planned. And they waited for the perfect moment to strike back when their target felt safe. Margaret had won her daughter, and potentially was finding a second chance with the man she'd loved. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the final battle was still coming, and that Richard and Victoria were just waiting for the moment when Margaret had the most to lose before launching their last, most devastating attack. She was right to worry, because in exactly 2 weeks, Richard would make a move that would threaten everything Margaret had built. Not just her business empire, but the fragile family she was trying to construct from 30 years of broken pieces. Margaret spent 40 years building a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions, never imagining that empire would become the weapon her own family used against her. She thought winning the legal battle and exposing their smear campaign would end the war. She was wrong, because Richard and Victoria Hale had one final strategy, one last devastating move that would force Margaret to choose between the business she'd sacrificed everything to build and the daughter she'd sacrificed everything to find. This is the chapter where corporate warfare becomes personal warfare, where boardrooms become battlefields, and where Margaret learns that sometimes winning means losing everything you thought mattered, and discovering what actually does. The first indication something was wrong came during Margaret's Monday morning executive meeting. Her CFO, Robert Chin, a man who'd worked with her for 15 years, looked uncomfortable as he pulled up financial reports on the conference room screen. "Margaret, we need to discuss some unusual market activity," he said carefully. "Someone has been quietly acquiring shares of Hale Properties over the past 2 weeks. Small purchases through multiple shell corporations, nothing that would trigger disclosure requirements individually, but collectively." He pulled up a chart showing the shareholding structure. Someone now controls approximately 18% of outstanding shares. Combined with the family trust holdings that Richard and Victoria can vote, that's 29%. If they can convince just a few more institutional investors to side with them, they could force a vote to remove you as CEO and chair. The room fell silent. Margaret felt ice forming in her stomach. This was elegant, sophisticated revenge. They couldn't take her daughter, so they'd take her company instead. Margaret immediately called an emergency session with her attorneys and investment bankers. The situation was worse than she'd thought. Richard had orchestrated a sophisticated hostile takeover attempt, using his legal expertise to structure it in ways that skirted disclosure requirements until it was almost too late. They're positioning this as concerned family members protecting shareholder value, Thomas explained grimly, reviewing the legal filings. They'll argue that your recent personal drama, the public battle over Lily, the media attention, your distraction from business, has made you an ineffective CEO. They'll point to the deals you've lost, the partners who've expressed concerns, the time you've spent away from the office. They're building a case that you're no longer capable of leading the company you founded. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. This is about punishment, not business. The company's performance is strong. Our Q3 numbers were excellent. This is Richard trying to take away the one thing I valued more than my daughter 30 years ago. It's revenge, pure and simple. The bankers outlined her options, none of them good. She could fight the takeover by buying back shares herself, but that would require liquidating assets and taking on massive debt. She could find a white knight investor to take a friendly stake, but that would dilute her control. She could negotiate with institutional shareholders to maintain their support, but they'd want concessions, probably including her stepping back from day-to-day operations to focus on personal matters. Or she could do nothing and risk losing everything in a shareholder vote that was currently too close to call. There's one other option, Thomas said quietly. You could negotiate directly with Richard and Victoria. Give them what they want, a financial settlement, guaranteed board positions, maybe even succession rights, in exchange for them backing off the takeover. It would cost you, but you'd keep operational control. Margaret turned from the window, her expression fierce. Negotiate with them? Reward them for this attempt to destroy me? Never. They want a war? They'll get one. But as Margaret threw herself into fighting the takeover, 18-hour days meeting with shareholders, crafting counter-strategies, rallying her executive team, she began missing the things that had become precious to her. Weekly dinners with Lily and James. Morning coffee with her daughter before work. The simple presence of family in her previously empty mansion. One evening, she came home at midnight to find Lily still awake, waiting for her in the living room. You missed dinner again, Lily said quietly, not accusingly, just sad. James and I waited for 2 hours. We finally ate without you. Margaret felt guilt crash over her exhaustion. I'm sorry. This takeover attempt, it's consuming everything. I have a shareholder vote in 3 weeks that will literally determine whether I keep control of the company I built from nothing. I can't. Can't what? Lily interrupted gently. Can't prioritize family over business? Isn't that the exact mistake you made 30 years ago that you spent 3 decades regretting? The words hit Margaret like physical blows because they were true. Here she was, once again choosing her business empire over her family, letting fear of losing her company drive her to sacrifice the relationships she'd finally built. It's not the same, Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. 30 years ago, I gave you up voluntarily. This is different. They're trying to take my company from me. I'm fighting back. Lily stood and walked to her mother, taking her hands. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about the answer. If you had to choose, if there was no way to have both, would you choose the company or would you choose me? Choose us? Because right now, by working 20-hour days and missing every dinner and basically disappearing into corporate warfare, you're choosing. And I need to know if I'm watching you make the same mistake twice. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. Because Lily was right. And the terrifying thing was, Margaret wasn't certain what her answer would be. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her expensive bed in her empty bedroom and forced herself to confront the truth Lily had shoved in her face. What did she actually value more, the empire she'd built or the family she'd found? The company represented 40 years of her life, her identity, her proof that she mattered and had power. Losing it would feel like losing herself. But Lily and James represented something she'd thought was permanently lost. Connection, love, the possibility of a life that wasn't just achievement and acquisition. She thought about her father, the man who'd forced her to give up Lily, who'd built the original Hale fortune and taught her that success meant sacrifice and sentimentality was weakness. She'd spent her entire adult life trying to prove she was worthy of his legacy, trying to show that giving up her daughter had been worth it, because look at what she'd built. But what if the legacy she was fighting so hard to protect was actually the cage that had imprisoned her for decades? The next morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She called in sick to work and spent the day with Lily. They went shopping, had lunch at a casual restaurant where no one recognized them, walked through a park, and talked about nothing important. And Margaret realized with startling clarity that this simple day with her daughter made her happier than closing any deal had in years. That evening, when James joined them for dinner, Margaret made an announcement that surprised everyone, including herself. "I'm going to step back from fighting the takeover," she said calmly, though her hands were shaking slightly. "Not surrender, exactly. But I'm going to stop treating it like life or death. I'm going to stop working 20-hour days. I'm going to prioritize the family I found over the empire I built. Because Lily's right, if I lose my company but keep my family, I still have everything that matters. If I save my company but destroy my family in the process, what exactly did I win?" Lily's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Mom, I didn't mean you should just give up. I know the company matters to you. I wanted to matter more. But I don't want you to lose everything you built because of me." James reached across and squeezed Margaret's hand, understanding in his eyes. "That's the bravest thing I've heard you say," he said quietly. "And it's the thing I wish we'd both been brave enough to say 30 years ago, that the people we love matter more than the careers we're protecting." Margaret felt something unlock in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for decades. "I'm not giving up entirely," she clarified. "I'm just recalibrating priorities. If I lose the company, I'll survive. I'll build something else. But I can't lose you again, Lily. And I can't lose this second chance at family. Not for any amount of money or power. It's not worth it." But Margaret's new perspective didn't mean she was going to make Richard and Victoria's victory easy. The next morning, she called Thomas with a new strategy. "I want to offer Richard and Victoria a deal," she said. "Not a surrender, but a genuine compromise. They get guaranteed board seats, advisory roles, and a significant financial settlement, basically recognition and involvement without control. In exchange, they withdraw the takeover attempt, and we establish a family trust that includes Lily as an equal beneficiary alongside them. They don't get to cut her out of the family legacy, but they don't get cut out either. Everyone gets something. No one gets everything." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's remarkably mature and strategic. But Margaret, they might not accept. They want to win, not compromise. They want you punished." Margaret smiled, though there was steel in it. "Then we go public with the offer. We make them reject a reasonable family compromise in front of shareholders and the media. We show them for what they are, vindictive and greedy rather than concerned family members. Either way, we control the narrative." Thomas drafted the proposal, and they sent it to Richard and Victoria with a 48-hour deadline for response. For 2 days, Margaret waited, continuing to attend shareholder meetings but with less desperation, spending evenings with Lily and James, finding unexpected peace in not knowing the outcome. When the deadline passed with no response, Margaret understood what they'd chosen. They wanted total victory, not compromise. So she activated the final part of her strategy. She called a press conference and announced it all. Her proposal to Richard and Victoria, their refusal to even negotiate, her offer to step back from day-to-day operations but retain board oversight, her plan to create a family trust that included Lily alongside her niece and nephew, her acknowledgement that finding her daughter had changed her priorities. "I built Hale Properties over 40 years," Margaret told the assembled media, Lily standing beside her in a show of unified strength. "I'm proud of that achievement. But I also gave up my daughter for that empire, and I spent 30 years regretting that choice. I'm not making that mistake again. My brother and niece have made their priorities clear. They value control and money over family unity," Margaret continued. "I'm offering them involvement, recognition, and financial security. They're rejecting that in favor of a hostile takeover that would destroy this company's leadership and stability. I'm asking shareholders to support my proposed restructuring, one that keeps experienced leadership in place, provides succession planning, includes all family members equitably, and prioritizes long-term value over short-term power struggles. If shareholders decide they'd prefer Richard's approach, I'll accept that decision and move on. But I want everyone to understand what this fight is really about. It's about whether family means compromise and inclusion, or whether it means winner-take-all warfare." The press conference went viral within hours. The narrative shifted again. this time painting Margaret as the reasonable party trying to include everyone, and Richard and Victoria as vindictive relatives more interested in revenge than business health. The shareholder vote was scheduled for the following week. Margaret spent those days not desperately lobbying for votes, but instead hosting what she called family integration dinners. Evenings where she, Lily, and James would have institutional investors over for casual meals where they could see the real Margaret, the one who'd learned to balance business with humanity. It was risky, showing vulnerability to people who might use it against her, but it was authentic, and authenticity turned out to be surprisingly persuasive. Shareholders saw a CEO who'd grown, who'd learned from mistakes, who'd built something valuable, and was now mature enough to share it rather than hoard it. They saw a woman who'd spent 40 years being ruthless and was finally learning to be wise. And many of them found that more compelling than Richard's promise of experienced business-focused leadership that really meant putting profits before people. The night before the vote, Margaret couldn't sleep. She'd done everything she could, proposed reasonable compromise, fought smart instead of desperate, shown shareholders her evolution while maintaining her business credibility. Now it was out of her hands, and she discovered something surprising. She was okay with that. Win or lose tomorrow, she had Lily. She had James, and whatever they might become to each other. She had a family for the first time in 30 years. If she lost the company, she'd survive. She'd build something new, maybe something better. She walked downstairs at 2 a.m. to find Lily sitting in the kitchen, unable to sleep either. Nervous about tomorrow? Lily asked. Margaret poured herself tea and sat beside her daughter. Not as much as I should be, she admitted. Is that strange? I've spent 40 years building that company. It should terrify me to lose it. But sitting here with you, I realize that I've already won the only thing that really matters. Everything else is just details. The shareholder meeting was held at a downtown hotel ballroom, packed with investors, board members, media, and observers. Margaret arrived with Lily and James on either side of her, a deliberate statement about what she valued. Richard and Victoria were already there with their attorneys and supporters, looking confident. The voting process was formal, procedural, boring to anyone who didn't understand that billions of dollars and decades of work hung in the balance. Proxy votes were counted, institutional shareholders declared their positions, and slowly the numbers accumulated on the screen at the front of the room. Margaret watched calmly, her hand finding Lily's under the table. Whatever happened in the next hour, they'd face it together. The final tally came down to a single institutional investor, a pension fund that controlled 8% of shares and had remained uncommitted until the last moment. Their representative stood to announce their decision, and the entire room held its breath. Thornton Pension Fund has reviewed both proposals carefully, the representative said, her voice echoing in the silent ballroom. We've considered business performance, leadership stability, and long-term value creation. We appreciate the Hale family's passion on both sides of this issue. However, we believe that Ms. Margaret Hale has demonstrated not just business acumen, but the kind of personal growth and emotional intelligence that creates sustainable leadership. Her proposal for shared family governance, her acknowledgement of past mistakes, and her integration of personal values with business strategy represent the kind of evolved leadership we want to support. Thornton Pension Fund votes with management. We support Margaret Hale's continued leadership of Hale Properties. The room erupted in applause and gasps. Margaret felt Lily squeeze her hand tightly, felt James's hand on her shoulder, and realized tears were streaming down her face. She'd won. Not just the vote, but the chance to prove that you could choose family and still keep what you'd built. That growth was possible. That it was never too late to get your priorities right. Richard and Victoria left immediately after the vote without a word, their attorneys following with grim expressions. Margaret knew this wasn't over. They'd probably try other tactics, maybe lawsuits, maybe further attempts to damage her reputation. But she also knew she'd won the war that mattered. She'd proven to herself, to Lily, to the world, that she could choose differently than she had 30 years ago. That she could fight for family with the same ferocity she'd once reserved for business. That love could be as strategic and powerful as greed, and often more effective. At the press conference after the vote, Margaret stood at the microphone with Lily and James beside her, and spoke not just as a CEO but as a mother, a daughter, a woman who'd finally figured out what actually mattered. Today's vote wasn't just about corporate control, she said. It was about what kind of legacy we want to leave, one built on exclusion and revenge, or one built on inclusion and growth. I'm grateful that shareholders chose the latter. I want to say something to my brother and niece, even though they're not here, Margaret continued. Your family. You always will be. My door remains open for reconciliation. Not on your terms or mine, but on terms that respect everyone's place in this family, including Lily, including each other. Life's too short to spend it at war with the people who share your history. I hope someday you'll see that. The reporters asked the usual questions. Would she restructure? Would she retire early? Would there be legal consequences for the takeover attempt? But Margaret handled them with practiced ease, always bringing the conversation back to family, to values, to the idea that business success without human connection was hollow. And watching her, Lily felt overwhelming pride in this complicated, flawed, brave woman who'd chosen her twice. Once in giving her life, and once in fighting to keep her despite the cost. Maybe that was what family really meant, not perfection, but the willingness to choose each other repeatedly, especially when it was hard. That evening, they celebrated at the mansion with a quiet dinner. Just the three of them, no press, no shareholders, no attorneys. They toasted with expensive champagne Margaret had been saving for a major business victory. But this felt more important than any deal she'd ever closed. To family, Margaret said, raising her glass. To second chances, James added. To finally being home, Lily finished, and they drank and laughed, and for the first time in any of their lives, felt like they'd actually figured out what mattered. Margaret looked at her daughter and the man she'd loved across the dinner table in her mansion that used to feel like a museum and now felt like a home, and thought about the cosmic justice of it all. She'd spent 30 years building an empire to prove that giving up Lily had been worth something. But it wasn't until she'd been willing to risk that empire that she'd finally proven her priorities were right. Sacrifice was easy when you sacrificed the wrong things. The hard part was figuring out what you should actually be willing to lose, and what you should fight to keep no matter the cost. As the evening wound down and James prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the door while Lily cleaned up in the kitchen. They stood in the foyer, suddenly shy with each other, aware that something between them had shifted during this crisis. You asked me 6 months ago if there was a chance for us, Margaret said quietly. I said to ask me again after we figured out what family looked like. I think we're starting to figure it out. So I'm ready for that conversation now, if you are. James smiled, that slightly crooked smile that had undone her 30 years ago and apparently still worked. I'm ready. I've been ready for 30 years. But Margaret, I need you to know, I'm not going anywhere this time. Even if we decide we're better as co-parents than as partners, even if the romantic part doesn't work out, I'm committed to being in Lily's life. And yours. No matter what. Margaret felt something settle in her chest, security, maybe, or trust, or just the relief of knowing that this time, they were both brave enough to stay. Margaret had defeated the hostile takeover, reunited with her daughter, and was rebuilding a relationship with the man she'd loved and lost. Everything seemed perfect, or at least as perfect as complicated family dynamics could be. But perfection is always temporary, especially when your enemies have one final weapon they've been saving for exactly the right moment. This is the chapter where the past ambushes the present, where a secret buried for 30 years resurfaces at exactly the worst possible time, and where three people discover that DNA and love don't always tell the whole story. This is where everything changes again, and this time, the threat isn't from outside the family, it's from within. They were celebrating Lily's 29th birthday. The first birthday Margaret had been present for in her daughter's entire life, at an upscale restaurant in a private dining room away from public attention. James had given Lily a framed architectural drawing he'd done of the house she'd grown up in with her adoptive mother, a tribute to the woman who'd raised her when he and Margaret couldn't. Margaret had given her a set of keys and the deed to a downtown condo she'd purchased in Lily's name. Not the fortune some might have expected, but a home, security, independence. Lily had cried over both gifts, overwhelmed that these relative strangers who happened to be her parents were trying so hard to make up for lost time. They were laughing over dessert when Margaret's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She almost ignored it. She'd learned to protect family time. But something made her look. The message contained just 3 words and a PDF attachment. You should know. The PDF was labeled Amended Birth Certificate, 1996. Margaret's hands started shaking as she opened the attachment. It was indeed a birth certificate, but not the one she remembered signing 30 years ago. This one had been amended 6 months after Lily's birth, and it showed something that made Margaret's world tilt sideways. The document indicated that there had been a genetic discrepancy discovered during routine newborn screening, and subsequent DNA testing had been ordered by the adoption agency. The results, attached to the amended certificate, showed that while Margaret was definitely the biological mother, James Mitchell was not the biological father. There was a note from the adoption agency stating they'd attempted to contact Margaret about this finding, but she'd already signed away her parental rights and requested no further contact. They'd noted it in the file and moved forward with the adoption. For 30 years, this document had sat in sealed records, and someone, Margaret immediately suspected Richard or Victoria, had hired investigators to dig through every piece of paper related to Lily's adoption until they found ammunition. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. James wasn't Lily's father, which meant she forced herself to think back 30 years, to those months when she was 28 and in love with James, but also navigating the complicated world of real estate development. There had been a business trip, a conference in Chicago, a charming developer who'd taken her to dinner, gotten her drunk, and she'd blocked out that night, convinced herself it hadn't happened or hadn't mattered because she'd been with James, because she'd loved James, because the baby had to be his. She'd never even considered the alternative. And in 1996, prenatal paternity testing wasn't common or easily accessible. She'd simply assumed. She'd been wrong. And now, sitting in this restaurant with the man who thought he was Lily's father and the daughter who thought she knew her origins, Margaret had to decide. Did she tell them the truth right now and destroy this perfect evening, or did she hide it and let them find out another way? "Mom, what's wrong?" Lily asked, her voice cutting through Margaret's panic. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret looked at her daughter, this young woman who'd just started calling her mom, who'd fought so hard to be recognized, who'd saved her life and stood by her through corporate warfare and media attacks, and felt shame crash over her like a wave. "I need to tell you both something," Margaret said, her voice barely steady. "Something I just found out myself. Something that changes." She couldn't finish. How do you tell your daughter that the father she'd just started building a relationship with wasn't actually her father? How do you tell the man you're falling in love with again that the child you share isn't actually his? James reached across and took Margaret's hand. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it. We're family. We can handle anything." But the word family just made it worse, because what Margaret was about to say would redefine what family even meant for the three of them. "James isn't your biological father," Margaret said finally, the words coming out flat and devastating. "I just received an amended birth certificate showing that genetic testing was done when you were an infant, and James was excluded as your father. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. I thought." She couldn't continue because Lily's face had gone completely blank, shock overwhelming every other emotion. And James looked like he'd been physically struck, his hand dropping from Margaret's, his expression shifting through disbelief, hurt, and something that looked almost like betrayal. "I don't understand," James said quietly, his voice dangerous in its calmness. "You said I was her father. For 30 years, I thought I gave up my daughter. I lived with that guilt. I built my entire relationship with Lily on being her father. And you're telling me now that's not true? That you didn't even know?" Margaret's tears were flowing freely now. "I was with you. I was in love with you. I never thought, there was one night, a business trip, I got drunk, and there was a man and I barely remember, and I convinced myself it didn't happen or didn't matter because you and I were together, and I wanted the baby to be ours, and in 1996 we didn't have easy paternity testing, and I just assumed." She was spiraling, words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. But Lily wasn't listening. Lily stood up from the table, her chair scraping back loudly, her face still blank with shock. "So you're not my father," she said to James, her voice flat. "You're just what? Some guy who dated my mom 30 years ago? Some man who thought he'd abandoned his child, but actually just abandoned a random woman's baby." The cruelty in her words, intentional or not, made James flinch. "Lily, no," he started, but she cut him off. "So who is my father?" Lily demanded, turning to Margaret. "Do you even know? Or was it just some random business trip hookup that you were too drunk to remember? Is that my origin story? At least when I thought you gave me up because your family pressured you, there was some dignity in it. But this? This is just tawdry. Pathetic." Margaret felt each word like a knife. "Lily, please. I know this is shocking. I'm shocked too. But it doesn't change that you're my daughter. It doesn't change that James cares about you. We're still family." But Lily laughed, a harsh, bitter sound Margaret had never heard from her before. Family? We've known each other for what, 3 months? We shared some DNA and some emotional moments, and I thought I finally understood where I came from. But I don't. I don't know who my father is. I don't know if you even know. And apparently, the man I thought was my father is just collateral damage in your messy past. James stood then, his movements slow and deliberate like he was moving through water. I need to go, he said quietly. I need time to process this. Margaret, he stopped, looking at her like he didn't know her. Did you really not know? Or is this something else you hid for 30 years? The accusation hurt worse than anything because Margaret understood it. She'd hidden Lily's existence. She'd kept secrets. Why would he believe she hadn't known this too? I didn't know, Margaret said desperately. James, please. I would never have let you carry that guilt if I'd known you weren't her father. I wouldn't have. But he was already walking away, and Lily was grabbing her purse, and Margaret was standing alone in that private dining room surrounded by the remnants of a birthday celebration that had turned into a funeral for the family she'd thought they were building. Lily, wait, Margaret called, but her daughter didn't turn back. I need to be alone, Lily said, her voice breaking. I need to figure out who I actually am, since apparently everything I thought I knew was wrong. And then she was gone too, leaving Margaret standing there with birthday cake and champagne and the smoking ruins of everything she'd fought so hard to protect. Margaret stumbled home to her mansion that felt like a mausoleum again, and immediately called Thomas. They found it, she said without preamble. Richard and Victoria dug through sealed adoption records and found the amended birth certificate showing James isn't Lily's biological father. They sent it to me tonight, destroyed my daughter's birthday, destroyed everything we've built. I need to know, is it legal? Can we sue them for accessing sealed records? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, if those records were sealed, then yes, accessing them was probably illegal. But proving Richard and Victoria were responsible would be difficult. And more importantly, do you really want to start another legal battle when you should be focusing on repairing your relationships with Lily and James? Margaret knew he was right, but rage still burned through her grief. They did this on purpose. They waited until we were happy, until we felt safe, and then they set off this bomb. They couldn't take my company, so they took my family instead. For 3 days, neither Lily nor James would take Margaret's calls or respond to her messages. Margaret hired private investigators to find Lily's biological father, the developer from Chicago, if she could even track him down after 30 years. But that felt hollow and desperate. Even if she found him, what would that accomplish? Would Lily want to know the man who was the product of a drunken mistake rather than a love affair? Would it help or hurt to have another stranger enter this already complicated equation? On the 4th day, Margaret received a text from James. I need to see you. Tomorrow. The coffee shop where we first met. Margaret's heart leaped with fragile hope. Maybe he'd processed the shock. Maybe he'd realized that DNA didn't define family. Maybe he was ready to rebuild what had been shattered. She arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early, ordering tea she couldn't drink, watching the door with desperate anticipation. When James walked in, looking haggard and older than he had a week ago, Margaret's heart broke all over again. James sat down across from her and was quiet for a long moment before speaking. I've spent 4 days trying to figure out how I feel, he said finally. About you, about Lily, about the fact that I'm not her biological father. And here's what I've realized, I'm angry. Not about the DNA, but about the fact that you didn't know. That you were careless enough to not be certain whose child you were carrying. That you let me carry guilt for abandoning my daughter for 30 years when she wasn't even mine. Margaret felt defensive anger rise. I was 28 and human, and I made a mistake one night that I barely remember. I'm not proud of it, but I didn't intentionally deceive you. I genuinely believed you were her father. James shook his head. I know. Rationally, I know that. But emotionally, I feel like I've been living a lie. Like the guilt I carried, the grief over giving her up, the joy of finding her. None of it was real because it was based on false information. But it was real, Margaret said desperately. Your grief was real because you loved me and thought we'd created a child together. Your joy at finding Lily was real because she's an amazing young woman worth loving regardless of genetics. James, you told me yourself when we first reconnected. You wanted to be in her life even if the romantic relationship with me didn't work out. Does DNA really change that? James looked at his coffee, wrestling with something. I don't know. Part of me says no, that I've spent months building a relationship with Lily, that I care about her for who she is. But another part feels like I was playing a role that wasn't actually mine to play. I was her father when I thought we shared blood. Now I'm just what? My ex-girlfriend's daughter from a one-night stand? Where's my place in that story? The pain in his voice was genuine, and Margaret understood it even as it hurt her. Your place is wherever Lily wants you to be, and wherever you choose to be. Family isn't just blood, James. You know that. That's easy to say when you're the one with the biological connection, James said, and there was an edge to his voice now. You're still her mother regardless of who her father is. But me? I'm disposable. I'm the guy who thought he had a daughter, but was actually just a placeholder for whoever actually contributed the other half of her DNA. Margaret reached across the table, grabbing his hand even when he tried to pull away. You are not disposable. You spent months getting to know Lily. You gave her a connection to her past, to her history. You showed up when she needed a father figure, regardless of what a DNA test said. That matters. That's real. Please don't let Richard and Victoria destroy what we've built by releasing a 30-year-old document that changes facts but doesn't have to change feelings. James finally met her eyes, and what Margaret saw there wasn't hatred or even anger anymore. It was grief. I need time, he said quietly. Time to figure out if I can be Lily's father without biology connecting us. Time to figure out if I can trust you again after this. Time to figure out who I actually am in this story. Margaret felt tears threatening, but held them back. How much time? She asked. James stood, preparing to leave, and looked at her with something that might have been compassion or might have been pity. I don't know. But Margaret, you need to focus on Lily right now. She's the one who's really been hurt by this. She's lost her sense of who she is, where she comes from. She needs her mother, even if she doesn't want me. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, I don't think you intentionally deceived anyone. I think you made a mistake 30 years ago and then made the very human error of believing what you wanted to be true. But that doesn't make the consequences any less painful for everyone involved. And then he was gone, leaving Margaret alone in the coffee shop with cold tea and the crushing realization that she might have permanently lost both him and Lily over a secret she hadn't even known she was keeping. Margaret spent the next week trying to reach Lily. Calls, texts, showing up at the condo she'd given her daughter only to find the doorman had instructions not to let her up. Finally, she received a text. I'm staying with a friend. I need space. I need to figure out who I am without you and James and the story I thought I knew. Please respect that. Margaret wanted to scream, to demand that Lily let her explain, let her help, let her be present. But she forced herself to respect her daughter's boundary even as it killed her. She hired the investigators to track down the Chicago developer, and after 3 days they found him. David Chun, now 60 years old, remarried with grown children who knew nothing about a possible daughter from a conference 30 years ago. The investigators had approached him carefully, and his initial response had been shock followed by denial followed by a reluctant agreement to take a DNA test if it was really necessary. Margaret authorized it, knowing this was potentially opening another can of worms but needing to give Lily answers if she wanted them. The DNA results came back 2 weeks after the birthday dinner that had destroyed everything. David Chun was indeed Lily's biological father, 99.99% certainty. The investigators included his background. Successful commercial developer, married with 2 adult children, stable life, no scandals. He'd agreed to meet Lily if she wanted to meet him, but emphasized he had no expectations and understood this was her choice entirely. Margaret stared at the report, holding in her hands the identity of the man whose drunken encounter with her had created the daughter she loved more than anything. And she had to decide, did she give this information to Lily, potentially adding another complicated relationship to an already overwhelming situation? Or did she keep it to herself and deprive Lily of the choice? After everything, after all the secrets and revelations, Margaret knew there was only one right answer. She texted Lily, I found your biological father. I have his information when you're ready. No pressure. Your timeline. Your choice. I love you. 3 days of silence followed. Then, late one night, Margaret's doorbell rang. She answered to find Lily standing on her doorstep, looking thin and exhausted, wearing clothes that looked slept in, eyes red from crying. I need to know, Lily said without preamble. I need to know who he is. I need to see the report. Mom, I need my mother. The last word came out as a sob, and Margaret pulled her daughter into her arms, both women crying on the doorstep, holding each other like lifelines. They moved inside, and Margaret gave Lily everything. The full investigator's report, David Chen's background, the DNA results, his willingness to meet if she wanted. Lily read it all silently, tears streaming down her face, and Margaret sat beside her, holding her hand, not offering explanations or justifications, just presence. Just being the mother Lily needed in that moment. "I'm so angry at you," Lily said finally, not letting go of Margaret's hand even as she said it. "Angry that you didn't know who my father was. Angry that you were careless. Angry that you let me build a relationship with James thinking he was my father when he wasn't. But I'm also angry at myself for being angry, because I know it was a mistake. I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen. And mostly I'm just sad. Sad that my origin story isn't the love story I thought it was. It's just a mistake. A drunk night at a business conference. That's where I come from." Margaret squeezed her hand. "No, you come from me. From my body, my blood, my choice to carry you and give you life even when everyone told me not to. David Chen contributed DNA, but he didn't create you. I did. And regardless of the circumstances of conception, you are not a mistake. You were the best thing I ever did, even when I didn't have the courage to keep you." They talked for hours, about shame and mistakes, and the difference between how you're conceived and who you become. About James and whether he'd come back or whether Lily wanted him to. About David Chen, and whether Lily wanted to meet him or whether knowing his name was enough. About the cruelty of Richard and Victoria in releasing this information when they did, and whether Margaret should pursue legal action or just let it go. Slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild what had been shattered. "I think I need to meet him," Lily said finally, talking about David Chen. "Not because I want a father. I'm 29 years old. I don't need a dad. But because I need to know where that half of me comes from. I need to look at him and see if I recognize anything in myself. I need to close that loop." Margaret nodded. "I'll arrange it. Whenever you're ready. And Lily, if you want me there, I'll be there. If you want to do it alone, I'll respect that too." But even as Margaret and Lily began to heal, James remained absent. Margaret sent him updates, that Lily was okay, that they'd found her biological father, that they were working through the trauma together. But he never responded beyond brief acknowledgments. And Margaret realized with painful clarity that while she and Lily shared unbreakable biology, James had no such anchor keeping him tethered to their messy family drama. He'd come back into their lives out of love and guilt and hope, but DNA revelations had severed those ties, and she had no idea if they could be repaired. The question wasn't whether Margaret and Lily would survive this. Margaret knew they would, knew their bond was strong enough to weather even devastating revelations. The question was whether their fragile new family could survive, or whether James would permanently walk away, leaving them as a duo instead of the trio they'd almost become. And Margaret discovered that even after winning her daughter back, even after defeating corporate takeovers and media attacks, she could still lose the one thing she hadn't known she wanted until it was gone. A second chance at the love she'd given up 30 years ago. Margaret and Lily had survived revelations that would have destroyed most relationships. They'd fought through hostile takeovers, media attacks, and devastating secrets about Lily's paternity. But they'd done it as a duo, without James, without the family unit they'd almost built. This is the final chapter, where three people scattered by truth have to decide if they can come back together, where a biological father meets the daughter he never knew existed, where chosen family proves stronger than blood, and where love gets its last chance to heal what 30 years of secrets and shame have broken. This is where everything ends, one way or another. This is where we discover if redemption is real, or if some families are just too broken to fix. The meeting with David Chen was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the birthday dinner that had exploded their lives. Lily had requested that Margaret come with her. Not to speak, just to be present, a silent support system while Lily met the biological father, who was a complete stranger. They arrived at the coffee shop early, both dressed carefully. Not too formal, not too casual, like they were attending a job interview for a position neither of them was sure they wanted. David Chen arrived exactly on time, and Lily's breath caught when she saw him walk through the door. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable. She had his eyes, the exact shade of brown, and something about the shape of his face echoed in hers. He was 60 now, graying but distinguished, wearing expensive casual clothes that suggested success without ostentation. He spotted them immediately. Margaret had sent him photos, and approached with visible nervousness. "Lily," David said, his voice careful, respectful. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I didn't know. About that night 30 years ago. If I had known Margaret was pregnant, if I had known there was a child." He trailed off, looking at Margaret with something between apology and confusion. Margaret spoke for the first time. "You wouldn't have known how to reach me. I left the conference early, went back to my life, never thought about that night again until—" She gestured to Lily. "Until the consequences couldn't be ignored anymore." It was blunt, almost harsh, but honest. David nodded slowly, then focused entirely on Lily. "I don't know what you want from me, or what you need. But I want you to know, I have 2 other children, both in their 20s. When I told them about you, they were shocked, but they want to meet you if you're interested. You have siblings. Half-siblings, technically, but family." Lily's eyes widened. Siblings. She'd grown up alone in foster care, dreaming of family, and now suddenly she had not just a mother, but a biological father and half-siblings she'd never imagined. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "To meet them. Not right away. I need time to process all of this. But eventually, yes." They talked for 2 hours, David sharing stories about his life, his family, his work. Lily shared carefully edited versions of her childhood, her adoptive mother, her search for Margaret. It wasn't warm, exactly. There was too much strangeness, too much shock, but it was civil, respectful, the beginning of something that might eventually resemble a relationship. When David finally left, promising to stay in touch and coordinate a meeting with Lily's half-siblings when she was ready, Lily slumped in her chair, exhausted. "That was the most surreal experience of my life," she said. "He seems nice. Normal. Not like a villain or a saint, just a person who made a mistake 30 years ago and now has to deal with the consequences." Margaret reached across and squeezed Lily's hand. "How do you feel?" Lily considered the question seriously. "Weird. Validated, maybe? Like, I have a biological father who isn't a monster or a mystery anymore. He's just a guy. And I have siblings, which is something I've wanted my whole life. But also, it makes me realize that biology doesn't automatically create connection. I talked to David for 2 hours, and I don't feel like he's my father. He's just a man who shares my DNA. Whereas you—" She looked at Margaret, tears forming. "You're my mother. Not because of genetics, but because you've shown up. You've fought for me. You've chosen me repeatedly even when it cost you everything. That's what makes you my mom." Margaret felt tears streaming down her own face. "That means more to me than you know. But Lily, I need to tell you something. Something I've been thinking about for weeks. The same thing that makes me your mother. Choosing you, showing up, fighting for you. That's what made James your father too," Margaret said carefully. "Not the DNA. The choice. He spent months building a relationship with you. He showed up, he cared, he was present. The DNA revelation devastated him because he thought it invalidated all of that, made it somehow less real. But it didn't. The relationship you two built was real regardless of genetics. And I think he's struggling with whether he has the right to maintain that relationship now that he knows the truth." Lily was quiet for a long moment. "I've been so focused on my own hurt, finding out my origin story was different than I thought, that I didn't really consider what this did to James. He lost his identity as my father. That must have been devastating." She looked at Margaret with sudden clarity. "Mom, do you love him? Like, really love him, not just nostalgia for what you had 30 years ago?" Margaret felt her breath catch because no one had asked her that directly, and she hadn't let herself fully examine the answer. "Yes," she said finally. "I love him. I loved him 30 years ago, and I think I never stopped. I just buried it under guilt and regret and the belief that I didn't deserve happiness. When he came back into my life, it felt like coming home. And watching him with you, seeing him try to be your father, seeing him show up and stay even when it was complicated. I fell in love with who he is now, not just who he was. But I've lost him. The DNA revelation destroyed whatever trust we were rebuilding. And I don't know if he can forgive me for not knowing, for being careless enough 30 years ago that I couldn't be certain who your father was." Lily squeezed her hand. "Then we need to fight for him. The way he fought for us. The way you fought for me. Because if he's part of this family, if he matters to both of us, then we don't just let him walk away because things got complicated." What neither Margaret nor Lily knew was that at that exact moment, James was sitting in his own apartment across the city, staring at a letter he'd written and rewritten a dozen times. The letter was addressed to Lily, and it said everything he'd been too afraid to say in person. That the DNA didn't matter, that he still wanted to be her father if she'd let him. That family was about choice, not chromosomes. That he was sorry for disappearing when she needed him. That he'd been a coward for the second time in his life, and he was done running. He'd spent 3 weeks wrestling with hurt and betrayal, and the feeling that his place in their lives had been built on false information. But somewhere in the darkness of those weeks, he'd realized something crucial. His love for Lily hadn't been based on DNA. It had been based on who she was: brave, kind, resilient, someone who'd survived foster care and found the strength to search for her biological mother despite knowing she might be rejected. That person was worth loving regardless of whether they shared genetic material. James sealed the letter and looked at his phone, seeing the dozen unread messages from Margaret updating him on Lily's well-being, on the discovery of David Chun, on today's meeting. He'd read every message but hadn't responded, hadn't known what to say. But now, looking at that letter, he realized words on paper weren't enough. If he was going to do this, if he was going to claim his place in their family, he needed to show up. Actually show up in person, with all his messy feelings and hurt and love and hope. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, not sure where he'd find them but knowing he had to try. His phone buzzed with a location tag from Margaret's last message. The coffee shop where he and Margaret had first reconnected. Of course. Everything in this story seemed to circle back to beginnings, to chances to try again, to redemption that kept offering itself even to people who didn't deserve it. James arrived at the coffee shop just as Margaret and Lily were preparing to leave. He stood in the doorway, backlit by morning sun, and both women froze when they saw him. For a moment, no one moved. Then Lily stood, her chair scraping back, and walked toward him with an expression James couldn't read. Anger? Hope? Relief? She stopped a few feet away, looking at him with those eyes that weren't his but that he'd come to love anyway. You're here, she said simply. I'm here, James confirmed. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm sorry I disappeared when you needed me. I'm sorry I let hurt override love. But I'm here now, and if you'll let me, I'd like to be your father. Not because of DNA. Not because of some obligation. But because I choose you. Because spending time with you these past months has been one of the best parts of my life. Because family is about who shows up, and I want to show up for you. If you'll have me. Lily's face crumpled, and she closed the distance between them, hugging him fiercely. You idiot, she said into his shoulder, crying. You scared me. I thought you'd decided we weren't worth the complication. That the DNA thing was too much. That you'd leave like everyone else in my life has left. James held her tight, his own tears flowing freely now. I'm not leaving. I'm done leaving. I left once 30 years ago because I was a coward. I started to leave again 3 weeks ago for the same reason. But I'm not that person anymore. You and your mother have taught me that courage isn't about avoiding pain. It's about showing up despite it. He pulled back to look at her face. Lily, I don't need to be your biological father to be your dad. If you want me to be part of your life, I'm here. For birthdays and holidays and random Tuesday dinners and whatever else families do. For the rest of my life, if you'll have me. Then James looked over Lily's head to where Margaret stood watching, and their eyes met across the coffee shop. Everything he felt was probably visible on his face: love, forgiveness, hope, fear. Margaret crossed the distance between them, and when Lily stepped back to give them space, James and Margaret stood face to face for the first time since the birthday dinner that had destroyed everything. I'm sorry, Margaret said before James could speak. Sorry that I didn't know who Lily's father was. Sorry that my carelessness 30 years ago hurt you. Sorry that I let you carry guilt about abandoning your daughter when she wasn't even yours. Sorry for all of it. James shook his head. You don't need to apologize for being human. For making mistakes. We all made mistakes 30 years ago. We were young and scared and let other people control our choices. The question isn't whether we made mistakes. It's whether we can forgive each other for them and build something real from here forward. I love you, Margaret said, and the words came easier than she expected. I loved you 30 years ago, and I love you now. I love who you were and who you've become, and the way you love my daughter, even when DNA says you don't have to. I love that you came back even after I gave you every reason to leave. And if you'll give me another chance, give us another chance, I promise I won't waste it. No more secrets. No more choosing business over family. No more letting fear make my decisions. James smiled, that crooked smile that still undid her completely. I love you too. I've loved you for 30 years, even when I tried not to. And I'm tired of running from the best thing that ever happened to me. He glanced at Lily, who was watching them with tears and a smile. From the best things. Plural. He took Margaret's hand, then reached out to Lily, pulling her into a three-way embrace that looked ridiculous and felt perfect. So we're doing this? He asked. We're actually being a family? A weird, unconventional, assembled from broken pieces family? Yes, Margaret and Lily said simultaneously, and all three of them laughed. The kind of surprised, relieved laughter that comes after tears, after pain, after surviving something that should have destroyed you but somehow made you stronger instead. They sat down together, ordered coffee and breakfast, and spent the next 3 hours just talking. Not about DNA or corporate takeovers or media attacks, but about simple things. James's architectural projects. Lily's plans to go back to school. Margaret's decision to step back from day-to-day operations at Hale Properties to focus on strategic planning and family time. They made plans for Lily to meet her half-siblings with both Margaret and James present for support. They discussed holidays. Would they all spend Thanksgiving together? Christmas? They talked about introducing James to Lily's adoptive mother's family, who were still important to her. They began the delicate, beautiful work of becoming a family not through biology or obligation, but through intentional, daily choice. 6 months later, on a Saturday afternoon, Margaret stood in her mansion's garden watching an improbable scene unfold. Lily was introducing her half-siblings, David Chen's children, Monica and Eric, to James's elderly mother, who'd flown in from Arizona specifically to meet her granddaughter. David Chen himself was there with his wife, awkwardly but kindly trying to integrate into this strange family constellation. Thomas and Diana were there, having become friends beyond their professional roles. Dr. Sarah Chun, the therapist who'd helped them navigate the initial reunion, was there with her own family. Even Margaret's household staff had been invited, the people who'd witnessed both the isolation and the healing. It was chaotic and beautiful, and nothing like the carefully controlled social events Margaret used to host in this same garden. This was messy and real, and full of people who cared about each other for complicated, hard-won reasons. James found Margaret standing slightly apart, watching the scene with an expression of wonder. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into him, still amazed sometimes that this was real, that they'd actually built this. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about the Margaret of 30 years ago," she said quietly. "The one who gave up her baby because she was too afraid to fight for what mattered. The one who spent decades building an empire, but living in isolation. I wish I could go back and tell her that everything she feared, losing her career, losing her family's approval, being seen as a failure, that none of it mattered compared to this. Compared to having people who love you for real, messy, human reasons." She turned in his arms to face him. "I wish I could tell her that 30 years later, she'd get a second chance. That her daughter would find her. That you'd come back. That family could be built instead of just inherited." "You know what I think she'd say?" James asked. "I think she'd say the waiting was worth it. That sometimes you have to lose everything to figure out what actually matters. That 30 years of regret can be redeemed if you're brave enough when the chance comes." He kissed her forehead. "We're getting married, by the way. I haven't officially asked yet, and I don't have a ring, but we're both almost 60 years old and we've wasted enough time. So yes, we're getting married. You can say no, but I'll just keep asking until you say yes, so you might as well save us both the trouble." Margaret laughed, a real, full laugh that she'd never allowed herself when she was younger, too controlled, too afraid of appearing undignified. "That's possibly the worst proposal in history," she said. "But yes. Of course yes. I've already lost you twice. I'm not stupid enough to let it happen a third time." Lily, watching from across the garden with her half-siblings, saw the embrace and knew immediately what had just happened. She squealed, actually squealed like a teenager despite being 29, and ran over, dragging Monica and Eric with her. "Did he just propose? Tell me he just proposed." Margaret and James turned, both laughing, and before Margaret could answer, Lily was hugging them both. "Finally. I was wondering how long it would take you two to figure out what everyone else could see. You're getting married." The commotion drew everyone's attention, and suddenly the entire garden gathering was celebrating. David Chun toasting with champagne, Thomas making jokes about prenuptial agreements, James's mother crying happy tears and hugging Margaret like they'd been family for years instead of hours. And Margaret, standing in the center of this chaos she'd never have allowed into her controlled life a year ago, felt happier than any business deal had ever made her. This was what she'd been missing. This was what actually mattered. As the party continued into evening, Lily pulled Margaret aside for a private moment. They sat on a bench at the edge of the garden, the sounds of celebration floating over to them, fairy lights beginning to twinkle as dusk fell. "Thank you," Lily said simply. "For everything. For giving me life, even when you couldn't keep me. For fighting for me when I found you. For choosing family over your company when it would have been easier to let me go. For bringing James back. For building this." She gestured to the garden full of people. "For showing me that family isn't just what you're born into, it's what you build." Margaret took her daughter's hand, still amazed sometimes that she had the right to touch her, to love her, to call her daughter. "I should be thanking you. You're the one who had the courage to find me. You're the one who forgave me when you had every right not to. You saved my life twice, once with blood, and once by giving me a reason to finally live correctly." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, then Lily said, "You know what the best part is? I get to be at your wedding. I get to see my mother marry my father, not my biological father, but my actual father, the one who chose me. I get to have that moment that most people take for granted, but that I never thought I'd have. That's everything, Mom." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face for approximately the 1,000th time in the past year, but these were different from all the tears before. These were pure joy, pure gratitude, pure awe at how devastatingly wrong her life had been a year ago and how impossibly right it was now. "It's everything for me too," she said. "All of this. You, James, this chaotic, beautiful family we've assembled. A year ago, I was alone in this mansion, successful but empty. Now look at us." They looked together at the garden full of people, this collection of biological connections and chosen relationships that somehow formed a coherent whole. 3 months later, Margaret and James were married in that same garden, with Lily as the officiant. She'd gotten certified online specifically for this purpose, and every person who mattered present. David Chun gave a toast about second chances and the families we don't expect. James's mother spoke about the daughter-in-law she'd waited 30 years to meet, and the granddaughter who'd appeared from nowhere and immediately stolen her heart. Thomas made everyone laugh with stories about Margaret, the ruthless businesswoman, learning to prioritize family dinners over board meetings. And Lily, standing before her mother and James as they exchanged vows, spoke about what it meant to witness two people brave enough to love each other despite 30 years of separation, despite mistakes, despite every reason the world gave them to stay apart. "You two taught me that family is a choice," Lily said. "And every day I choose you. Every day I'm grateful that you chose each other, and that you chose me. Welcome to the family. All of us. The ones we were born into, the ones we found, and the ones we built from scratch." The reception lasted until midnight, and at one point Margaret found herself dancing with Lily while James danced with his mother nearby, and she caught sight of Richard and Victoria standing at the edge of the garden. They'd been invited. Margaret had sent the invitation knowing they probably wouldn't come, but wanting to offer one more olive branch. And here they were, lurking at the periphery, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Margaret walked over to them, Lily following, and for a moment they all just looked at each other. These people who'd been family by blood but enemies by choice for so long. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said simply. "You're welcome here. Your family. If you want to be." Richard looked like he wanted to say something cutting, but Victoria put her hand on his arm. "Congratulations," Victoria said stiffly. "You look happy." It wasn't much. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation or the healing of decades of hurt. But it was something. A beginning, maybe. Or at least not an ending. When the last guests left and the caterers cleaned up and the fairy lights were turned off, Margaret and James and Lily sat together on the terrace, exhausted and happy, still in their wedding clothes, sharing one final bottle of champagne. "So this is our life now," James said, looking at his new wife and daughter. "This is our family." "This is our family," Margaret confirmed. "Weird, unconventional, assembled from broken pieces and second chances. The best kind of family," Lily added. "The kind you choose. The kind you fight for. The kind that doesn't give up even when DNA tests and hostile takeovers and 30 years of separation say you should." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge over the city. Three people who'd lost each other, and found each other, and chosen each other, over and over, until choosing became as natural as breathing. And Margaret thought about the locked room in her mansion that now stood open, the baby clothes donated, the grief transformed into joy, the past finally at peace with the present. Lily stood and raised her champagne glass one more time. To the family we were given, she said. To the family we found. And to the family we chose. To second chances. To forgiveness. To love that's strong enough to survive anything. And to the three of us, who were stupid enough to almost let this slip away, but smart enough to fight like hell to keep it. To us, Margaret and James echoed, and they clinked glasses, and the sound rang out clear in the night air. A small, perfect sound of celebration, of triumph, of love that had been lost and found and chosen, over and over until it became unbreakable. The mansion that had been a mausoleum was now a home. The empire that had been everything was now just one part of a fuller life. The daughter who'd been given away had come home. The love that had been abandoned had been reclaimed. And three people who'd spent 30 years separated by secrets and shame had finally become what they were always meant to be, a family. If this story moved you, if it made you cry, if it made you believe in second chances and chosen family and love that survives impossible obstacles, then hit that like button one final time and tell me in the comments. What was your favorite moment in this entire journey? Was it Margaret's first press conference acknowledging Lily? The shareholder vote? James coming back? The wedding? Because I want to know what resonated with you, what made you feel something real. This story is about redemption, about the fact that it's never too late to choose differently, to fight for what matters, to build the family you need rather than accepting the loneliness you inherited. Subscribe to my channel for more stories that dig deep into the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of human relationships. Stories where people aren't perfect, but they're real, where love requires work, but it's worth it, where families fall apart and fight to come back together. Thank you for taking this journey with Margaret, Lily, and James. Thank you for believing that broken people can heal, that lost time can be redeemed, and that family is always worth fighting for. Drop a comment telling me your story. Have you experienced reunion, redemption, or second chances in your own life? Have you built chosen family when blood family failed you? Share your truth because these stories matter, and you matter. And remember, it's never too late to choose love over fear, family over fortune, and connection over control. Until the next story, take care of each other, fight for the people who matter, and never give up on the possibility that tomorrow could be the day everything changes for the better. See you next time. But wait. 1 year after the wedding, Margaret sat in a hospital room holding her first grandchild, Lily's daughter, born just hours ago. Lily had met someone 8 months after the wedding, a social worker who worked with foster children and understood her history in a way few people could. Their relationship had moved fast, and the pregnancy had been unexpected but welcome. Now Margaret cradled this tiny life, her granddaughter, Hope Margaret Mitchelton. Lily had hyphenated her last name after the wedding, keeping both her adoptive mother's surname and claiming Margaret's, and felt the cosmic justice of it all. She'd given up a baby in this same hospital 30 years ago. Now she was here to welcome one, to be present from the first moments, to make sure this child never wondered if she was wanted or loved. "You're thinking about 30 years ago," James said quietly, reading her as he'd learned to do. "About the hospital room where you had to say goodbye to Lily." Margaret nodded, unable to speak around the emotion clogging her throat. "This is different," she managed finally. "This time I get to stay. I get to watch her grow up. I get to be grandma." She looked up at Lily, exhausted in the hospital bed, but smiling that same smile that had undone Margaret from the first moment she'd truly seen her daughter. "Thank you," Margaret said, "for letting me be here, for letting me have this, for giving me grandchildren when I thought that ship had sailed forever." Lily reached out and squeezed her mother's hand. "You're going to be the most overprotective, over-involved, wonderful grandmother in history. This kid is so lucky she doesn't even know yet." Later that day, David Chin arrived with his children, Hope's other grandparents and aunts and uncles, because this child would have an embarrassment of family riches, would never know what it felt like to be alone or unwanted. And when Richard and Victoria sent flowers with a card congratulating Lily, Margaret cried again. Not because it was everything she wanted from them, but because it was something. A recognition that they were all family, however complicated. That new life had a way of softening old wounds. That maybe, eventually, Even the deepest rifts could begin to heal if people kept choosing connection over pride. The mansion that had been empty now had a nursery prepared in the room next to Lily's old suite. The company that had almost cost Margaret everything now had a succession plan that included multiple family members, shared leadership, and plenty of time for Margaret to be present for her granddaughter's life. The empire that had once been everything was now just one part of a rich, full, complicated, beautiful life. That evening, when visiting hours ended and most family had left, just Margaret, James, and Lily remained in the quiet hospital room, the baby sleeping peacefully in Lily's arms. "Do you ever think about the Margaret of 30 years ago?" Lily asked her mother, echoing the question Margaret had asked herself a dozen times. "The one sitting in a room like this, alone, giving up her baby?" "All the time," Margaret admitted. "I wish I could go back and tell her that everything she's afraid of, the judgment, the career consequences, the family rejection, that it all works out in ways she can't imagine. That the baby she's giving up will come back. That the love she's losing will return. That 30 years of regret can be transformed into joy if she's brave enough when the chance comes." She looked at her daughter holding her granddaughter. "But I also know she wouldn't believe me. She'd think it was too good to be true. Sometimes you have to live through the darkness to appreciate the light. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what actually matters." "What would you tell her?" Lily asked. "If you could send a message back 30 years to the woman you were?" Margaret thought about it carefully. "I'd tell her that love is always worth the risk. That family, real family, chosen family, fought for family, is worth any sacrifice. That 30 years feels like forever, but it's not. Redemption is always possible if you're brave enough to accept it when it comes. That the empire you're building will feel hollow without people to share it with. And most importantly, I'd tell her that the baby she's giving up is going to grow into the most extraordinary woman, and that woman is going to save her life in more ways than one." Margaret stood and kissed Lily's forehead, then kissed the baby's tiny head. "But mostly, I'd tell her to hold on, to survive, to wait, because joy is coming, even if it takes 30 years to arrive. And it will be worth every moment of the wait."